right, everybody, we are live for another episode of the Perceptive podcast here on Game Wisdom, where some of the art and science of games. We got a good one for tonight. We're going to be catching up with Arcen Games. They have just finished up development on AI Wars 2, and we are going to certainly be chatting about that tonight, as well as what is next for the company. So, for our cast, we have returning guest Chris Park and newcomer to Arcen Games, Willard Davis on. So, how are you guys doing?
Doing well.
Yeah, things are going well.
And I'm Chris McElligott Park now. That's my maiden name is Chris Park.
Oh, nice. Congratulations.
Thank you.
It is great to have you guys on. For longtime fans of Game Wisdom, Chris and I have been speaking, since like 2012. It seems like it's been It feels like it's been like so much longer since 2012 these days.
Yeah, it was a different world in a lot of ways. Hardware, software, political, environment,
yes.
everything. Just everything is different, which good and bad. Hardware-wise, awesome.
And Willard, this is your first time on. It is great to meet you.
Likewise.
All right. So, we certainly have a lot of catching up to do. So I figure for the new people who have joined the channel who may not know too much about Arcen, I'm going to give you guys a chance to talk a little bit about who you are, what is Arcen Games about, and of course, what is AI Wars 2?
Sure. So Arcen started, it was a side project sort of for me back in 2009. I came from business software before that. Had been working at a company doing kind of CRM type software for the affordable housing industry. And that was largely because game development was a big hobby for me since I was a kid. Never seemed viable. The workplace seemed incredibly toxic, etc. So I didn't want any part of that. And then right around 2009, when the first indie boom kind of happened, I found myself with a game, which was AI War 1, which never thought there would be a 2. But it was a game that was able to get on Steam. It was one of the earliest indie games on Steam. And then we just kept developing more. It grew the company, quit the day job. It was enough to, hire myself and Pablo Vega, the composer. And later on, grew to have more staff. And, we did really well in kind of the golden age. Well, depends on, the golden age, silver age, I don't know how you want to call it, for indies on Valve. If you were on Steam, if you were in, it was the golden age. And we were in. If you were not in, then it was a very frustrating time. This is all way before Steam Greenlight or anything like that. Nothing really changed much to the Steam Greenlight era, but once Valve opened things up dramatically, then we had a lot of market adjustment happen to us. And so we had basically collapsed down to just me for a long time. And, that's skipping a lot of intervening details. And we put out like 20 some products about, between DLCs and games. And, we've had so many collaborators work on different projects over the years, probably 30 people. Usually our team size is about 4 to 5 at most. And, then we ran a Kickstarter in 2016, actually 2, one for AI War 2 at a larger amount, 300,000, that was intended to be like a bigger project, and then that didn't work out, so we ran another one at 50 for a scaled down version. That worked out fine. We got about 116 out of that, and then we wound up building the giant version anyway, which was way more expensive than we thought, even with the original Kickstarter. So that had been fun in quotes, but turned out a really good game. And now I'll let Willard explain where he came from.
Sure. So I my background is enterprise file system development, so like super low level messy stuff. And I ran across an AMA from Chris and the other Arcen folks about AI War when they were pitching their Kickstarter. So I said, "Oh, that sounds interesting. I'm interested in things that are smart and challenging games." And then I backed their Kickstarter and said, let me buy the old game, see how it was. Then it turned out to be really fun, and I was sort of generically involved with when they were the pre-alpha phase, early alpha phase. I would open bug tickets for them and try to give feedback.
He's one of the only people who did as well. That's worth noting.
And eventually that turned into Chris saying, "Hey." Oh, and the other thing that I did was one of the factions in AI War is called the Nano Cost. And it's kind of Borg like, they assimilate your ships and take them over and use them for themselves. And I just made this as a mod. It was the first mod way, way before anything else happened. And eventually Chris was like, "Hey, you seem to know how to write reasonable code, and we're desperately behind schedule. Could we just give you commit access?" Because previously I'd also been like, "Hey, here's the..." So in AI War, some of the code is distributed in what's called external code, where you get the source code, and that's how you could do a lot of really powerful modding with the game. So I would also be looking at the code and be like, "Oh, yeah, there's the bug here that I was complaining about. Here's a patch. You could go add it to the code base." And eventually this turned into Chris saying, "Hey, would you like commit access, and could you take over this a small aspect of things that nobody else has time for at the moment?" And then one thing leads to another and another and another. But yeah, that is how I wound up in game dev land.
Nice.
Yeah. And he was essentially the lead designer on most aspects of the third and final DLC for AI War 2. And a lot of the most interesting innovations in the AI, aside from the structural stuff that I was putting together, but the actual logical stuff that makes the AI smarter. There's different, we could talk about how there's different things that enable an AI to be smart in the first place. But the logical side of things came from him, which is pretty cool.
Nice. And we were just having a discussion before we started the stream about how we did a strategy game roundtable a few months ago talking about intelligence and AI. And I'm sure if you were on that panel, we would be probably 4 hours in terms of that discussion.
Yeah, these are big topics. Is really what it boils down to. Is that there's never enough time to cover anything, because it's just everything is a rabbit hole in every direction.
That basically describes every one of these podcasts that we do, doesn't it?
Yeah.
Well, yeah, it's great to have you guys back on, and yeah, with following Arc, and I know for you, Chris, you've been, of course, very transparent about kind of the challenges and growth and difficulties of growth of Arcen over the past decade. And I know, as you said a few minutes ago with AI Wars 2, that of course it was the second Kickstarter that got the game or got the game's funding. I know you've been working on it. How long has AI Wars 2 been in development for?
5 years.
Mm-hmm.
Well, sort of. Closer to 6. It's been since 2016. So Keith started on some code. Keith is not here. He was the initial lead designer and code run that he and I worked together for a long time. Keith Lamont. I have always said his name incorrectly. It's not Keith Lamoth. It's Keith Lamont. He corrected me on this after about 8 years of knowing him and working with him. I was like, "Are you kidding me?" But yeah, it's not a phonetic spelling, turns out. Anyway, so the initial concept was that he was going to work on that. After the first Kickstarter failed, in particular, he was going to work on that. I was going to spend, 3 months, something like that, of my time helping out on a few structural things with this. And then I would be working on other projects. And the one I talked about in the Kickstarter in particular was one called Reverse AI War, which is kind of a descriptor, not really a name. But I did spend most of 2017, let's say 3/4 or maybe 2/3, depends, working on other projects. Not reverse AI, where I actually wound up working on something called Silent Halls, which there's some YouTube videos of. But so it kind of depends on exactly how you count it. Keith was working on it from, we had in 2016, and I was there some too, and then it became clear that the game was not any good in early 2018. Keith executed perfectly. He was really, really diligent, and he and I had come up with a really detailed design, which we had shared during the Kickstarter, and then revised design that we'd shared again. Everybody looked at that and said, yeah, that makes sense. That sounds like it's going to be a good game. And yeah, he made a very detailed plan. He executed it on time. Mission complete. Not any fun. So what do you do at that point? I mean, we had a couple options. This is early 2018. Here you go, Kickstarter, folks. None of you are really testing it. It's not any fun. Doesn't feel like AI War, but it's exactly what we promised. Exactly what we promised. Here you are. Enjoy. Yeah, it didn't seem like a great idea. Not a good career move. Not a good move in a whole bunch of respects. So Keith and I kind of renegotiated our arrangement with that. He had a big royalty stake in it, but the actual initial funding to pay for his time had run out, and so we reduced that portions in exchange for no further responsibilities on his part. So he runs a very successful software consulting business at this point outside the game industry, and he still is generally of the he came on in early 2011 with Arcen, and after what we went through in kind of the middle of the 2010s, his opinion has been kind of like, yeah, all right, if you still want to mess around in that games industry, that's a rough industry, but go for it if that's what you're gonna do. If you need work, I've got work out my ears over here, it's really lucrative if you want to come work with me. And I'm like, no, I love it over here. It's really hard, but I love it. And he's like, yeah, I loved it too, but we all have our different family needs and all that sort of stuff too. So yeah, we call that the pivot, and that's where I came in, dropped everything else I'd been doing, started in full-time, and then I was on it full-time for the next, whatever you want to call it, 4 years, basically 4 and a bit of change. And yeah, that meant rebuilding everything and trying to piece together what the heck makes a game feel like AI War, because the design that we had come up with, that a few thousand people, certainly a few hundred people, had looked at in detail and went, yeah, it looks good. It looks good on paper. That's wasn't cutting it. So we had to figure that out completely fresh. And for a long time, it was just me. And Willard as the lone tester at that point, who was providing feedback as we went. And then I think by maybe December of that year, or was that December 2017? I don't remember which year that was that you started.
It was a December, but I don't remember which one.
Oh, I know it was December 2017 because we released into early access in 2018, and other personal events went really south. And this has been an interesting project.
And I know we've spoken in the past a lot about that kind of challenge when, a system or maybe just individual mechanics just aren't working out. And with, your games being so massive in terms of how system heavy they are, that when you change one thing, it's, as you said, it's pretty much you have to just rebuild the whole thing. And it's certainly, I think, a very interesting challenge. Again, I know we've spoken about this before, with kind of going from AI War 1 to AI War 2 in terms of how do you build upon this game that was Arcan's most successful game in terms of where you go in terms of content, where you go in design. And for people watching, I know you guys just released, I believe it's your third major expansion. Is that right to the game?
Yep. Yeah, that was a giant one.
Yeah. So I guess what was kind of like the strategy then at that point in terms of what do we do with this concept and how do we kind of like right the ship?
Well, I can tell you what we did at various points, and I can also tell you what I think we should have done, which are two different answers. Now, there's a lot of things that. Hindsight's 2020, and in this particular case, I wouldn't really change how this project went in a grand scheme because I learned a lot from it. I've been doing this for a long time. I've been in software development for 21 years at this point. I've been in game software development for 13 at this point. But I've learned more on this one last project than on just everything prior, really. And a lot of that comes from making mistakes and then seeing what went wrong with those. And I think that I've been building games backwards, and I've gotten away with it. I think a lot of people get away with it. But I think that a lot of people build games backwards. And the reason I say backwards is that typically what I would imagine is the mature game loop. So once you know how to play and you're good at it, what is it like to play this game? We'll start from there. And okay, now what are the systems that are required in order to make that experience for you? And that's all well and good. There's been some interesting YouTube videos on how do we teach complex games and stuff like that. That was very insightful recently. But at the same time, I feel like they kind of fundamentally approach it from an angle that I do think is backwards. Because if you make every system circular and you have to teach all the systems before somebody can have kind of the less advanced version of the advanced experience you have in mind, it's really, really difficult to onboard people. You're going to have a learning curve or a learning cliff, depending on how well your tutorials go and or if you can design kind of like a scripted campaign or whatever. And this is not just strategy games. This is any game, really. Rocket League, whatever it is, it doesn't really matter. The Overwatch, whatever the meta is, League of Legends, it doesn't really matter. If you think about the mature experience first, then there's no path, there's no vertical slice that you can just say, here, this is fun right away. And I think that's one of the things Nintendo is really best at, and that I admire them for, is they've lost their way a few times. There's certainly some games where they have a lot of complicated systems, and here I'm going to point out Skyward Sword. They were introducing a whole bunch of new hardware and a bunch of other different things, and they spent 4 hours tutorializing players. This is very similar to like an Arcen title. If you look at what they seem to have learned from that, and they moved to Breath of the Wild and other things in the future, they're like, here, you get your underwear and a stick. See what this is actually fun. And you're like, you're right, it is. Wow, an apple, and then you're off to the races, and it gets very complex and builds from there versus needing this protracted introductory experience. And Breath of the Wild is a great example of a systems-driven game. There's a lot of
Yep.
I would point out IO Interactive with their newest Hitman series as being another great example of this working really well. They have a vertical slice that's the training mission, and you can just go in, and it is tutorialized, but it's small enough that you can just play, and you can just experiment. Oh, I see. When I'm standing here and I'm in the clothes of X type, people don't notice me. Oh, that's interesting. I wonder what I can do with that. And I'm actually penalized for killing anybody except for the main one. Well, that's awfully different. This is backwards from most games. So Hitman, in a lot of ways, has some of the same challenges of the AI War series. They're trying to train you to
Mhm.
do the exact opposite of what its contemporaries do. Don't kill anybody except for your target if you really want to do it well, and do it in a weird way, using as much creativity as you can. And that's very similar to AI War as well, where it's like, don't just take all the territory. Just take the ones that you really need and pay attention to how they're going to get you towards your self-set long-term goal. So in general, I think figuring out a really strong vertical slice, a la Breath of the Wild's Great Plateau and the way that progression happens, or the Hitman introductory tutorial, I think those are the really positive, like AAA sort of examples I would point to. Do it like that, and then
Mhm.
build outward. If you've got something rich enough, you'll be able to. If you're not able to, you don't have enough. So
Mhm.
try something else. But you'll find out you don't have enough pretty quickly.
And I think that's a really solid point. And I think what you just described there is like the exact reason why a lot of 4X and Grand Strategy games have just never really hooked me. And I have tried playing both AI Wars and AI Wars 2 in the past, and I struggled with this as well. It's
Yep.
that idea of, okay, here's the game, here's everything right here, go do what you want. And I'm just sitting there
Yep.
going, what the hell is all this? I have no idea. I have no frame of reference. I tried learning a Total War Three Kingdoms last year, and the same exact thing. I load it
Yep.
up. I get like this, like click here. You can turn this, build a unit. Now here's your entire empire. Now manage your entire faction for the next 100 or so turns, and I am completely lost. And I mean, we can certainly, of course, you brought up like Zelda. We can even talk about fighting games. That there are a
Yep.
lot of fighting games that suffer this as well.
If,
And
if you don't have the muscle memory already, you're hosed.
yeah, and it's always that challenge of how much do you assume the player's knowledge base is when you start playing. Because there are a lot of indie devs, not just in strategy games, but even something as simple as a platformer, who they
Yeah.
will start the game off, they won't even tell you how to jump.
Yeah.
Like, and again, like I have played enough platformers that I know every single combination of what jump could be. But if you never touch a platformer before, you're completely lost. Just as if you never touched a strategy game before.
The Gaming for a Non-Gamer series by Rasputin on YouTube I find fascinating, because he has his wife. It was a big jump in popularity for his channel when he started doing that. He has general analysis of games and sort of things, but then when he really started making his mark, he started getting his wife, or as he calls her, the lady I live with, who had no experience in games at all. He started exposing her to really in-depth games and trying to figure out what are the unspoken things that we all know, and what is our gamer vocabulary, what are the things that are taken for granted. And I don't think he's not the one who was talking about. There's somebody else who's doing something similar, but there's essentially it's almost an oral tradition, because most people get into gaming through their brother or their father or their sibling, whatever it is. Somebody else gets them into
Mhm.
it and shows them, oh yeah, this is how this works. Doesn't matter if it's Minecraft or Animal Crossing or it was the original Legend of Zelda or Mario Brothers, or it doesn't really matter. Somebody showed you,
Mhm.
and then you showed a bunch of other people, and so there's this weird oral tradition, um, and this kind of it makes it so that it's this kind of self-limiting thing. You've got the new gamer who is interested in stuff, but they only really get games. They only really play games that somebody else hands to them. Somebody trusted, a friend, a spouse, whatever, who is like, yeah, this is something I think you'll like. Oh, you don't? All right. Well, you probably like this then. And then so they've
Mhm.
got a like home shopper, personal curator for a good while, and then past some certain point, they've got enough gamer vernacular
Mhm.
vocabulary within whatever genres they're interested in, they start picking for themselves. And I think we often ignore that whole thing.
Yep.
And um, you know Arcen has always been kind of targeting the hardest of the hardcore, like people who are
Mhm.
thoroughly bored with the the deep end of the pool, and let's dig that pool a little deeper for you. And that's not the sole place I want to live. But it's been an interesting starting point, because that was initially like a competitive advantage for Arcen. Nobody else was serving that niche, so it made absolute sense. We were able to rule that niche for a while. Paradox certainly has been around for a while. They started serving that niche a lot more effectively than they had been previously. They previously existed, and there was a lot of room for Arcen to exist alongside them, and then they've kind of swallowed that end of the niche now. And so I don't really think Arcen could survive just trying to go head-to-head with Paradox for the next 20, 30 years. Like, that's not going to happen.
Yep, and I mean, that's like the same story I think a lot of indie developers have had to face, especially those who have come from like hardcore or very niche genres. Again, like games like Spelunky, La Mulana, so many other like games that, as you said, like they are aimed specifically at that hardcore audience. But the problem again is that a hardcore audience is like a drop in the bucket in a lot of cases compared to the mainstream, and it's why we've seen games like, one second, my ears just popped. It's why we've seen games like Hades, like Dead Cells, Slay the Spire, even again like Breath of the Wild, that go, okay, let's make this more approachable, so that yes, if you are that super hardcore player, you can enjoy this. If you've never touched this game before, if you have no idea, we can at least train you in that. You know, maybe you'll like it, maybe you won't, but at least you're given the opportunity. Like, I do my show, I need to get back to it, when I review clear rates and achievement rates in games, and there are people who will quit games within milliseconds. Like, there is, like, again, like, I know. And like even like the most popular games, like people will point out everything from Celeste to Elden Ring. I do want to touch on Elden Ring in a minute as well, but they will say these games are so amazing, you know, the quote unquote perfect game. But then I check their completion rates, and there are people like 10 to 20% of people, they're some within like 3 minutes of playing the game. Like they are just, they turn on, they go, oh my god, they turn it right off.
I think Undertale is an interesting example as well, because that's one that's like so beloved. I think this comes back, I'm not trying to promote the Rasputin's channel or something, but he comes up in this particular context a lot because he's been doing the most examination into this right now. But he had his wife play that as one of the earliest games, and when she was going to be playing RPGs of some sort. So he had like 4 different RPGs, like Final Fantasy VII, and you know, Undertale. And it was kind of like he asked on his YouTube channel, you know, what do you want? You know, what do you suggest? And that's the worst possible suggestion, because it's a great game, but in order to even get the jokes in that game, you have to be deeply immersed in the RPG genre that it is subverting. And it's just weird and random if you don't have that history. It'd be like watching Austin Powers if you've never even heard of James Bond. It's just nonsensical. Like, what is even happening here? Like, why is there a bald guy and a cat and stuff? Like, that doesn't, you know what I mean? Like, those jokes don't even land. They assume that you know about Bond. It's mildly funny if you don't know Bond, but, you know, any sort of parody requires understanding of the source material, with rare exceptions, and Undertale is not one of them.
Yep. And to your point that I want to kind of build off what you said a few minutes ago, I think it's a really good one, about being able to kind of capture like an individual or a smaller part of the game and to be able to show that and get somebody excited about. Like, this, again, is one of the most challenging parts of any kind of system-heavy design. Again, like strategy games is the perfect example. Can you take apart, let's say, building cities and civilization, throw that by itself, and entertain somebody? And even then, you know, how do you then go, okay, you've mastered this, now here's all the military, and here's all the research. And it's that genius. And this is something I said about in the Elden Ring when I was talking about that. Elden Ring, I think, works a lot in terms of its onboarding because it presents itself very small at the start. That even before they had to actually put in the prompt saying here's a tutorial, you can miss the entire tutorial, or you can take like 4 to 5 minutes. Here's how you run around. Here's how you walk. Here's how you slash, and then you open up the door. And I think there is something to be said about being able to present something as minute as possible, but it's still interesting. Like, one of the things I always say about a game like Total War or Grand Strategy is just, give me one city. Just give me like one city, one unit, and then let me start figuring things out on my own. Don't give me like 5 different provinces and 37 armies and say, okay, here's this giant mess of systems, try and untangle it.
I think this comes down to the weight of genres, and I'm extremely, extremely reluctant to play as a developer to develop in a specific codified genre at this point. People do need to understand what a game is quickly by looking at it. Oh, that's an RTS. That's a 4X. That's a city builder. That's a management game. Whatever. So there needs to be some sort of, okay, yeah, my muscle memory is going to work from something I already know. But to try and build a traditional 4X, there's no way that any one city is going to be interesting enough, because that's not how 4Xs work. The whole, if one city was that complicated, then managing 5 or 10 or whatever of them is going to be just ungodly. Just it's going to be terrible. And so you run into this catch-22, in combat. Well, that can't be too involved, or else it's going to really distract from the rest of the stuff. And you can even see with a lot of the recent 4X games, some of them from Paradox. What's the fantasy one that they did from 2014? What was that thing called?
I know the one you're talking about. I don't remember the name.
Yeah, they had like a mini game sort of thing. It's unfair to call it a mini game, but they had this miniature mode that would pop up when you would click from one to the click from one tile to the next, and you had these armies that were kind of compacted down. But then it was like, okay, now a little battlefield unfolds on 3 tiles or 4 tiles or something. You've got this back and forth that happens, and all right, in theory, you're addressing combat being too shallow in 4X games, which it generally is. I mean, because that's one of many, many, many systems in most of them. But that went over like a lead balloon with players because it took too long and it still wasn't that much more deep. Versus you have a game like Fire Emblem Three Houses, which it's a tactics game mostly, and those games are all about being interesting in combat. And then the combat's long, and that's how it's supposed to be. But then it has these stretches where it's basically a visual novel, and that pairing goes well together. The Total War series, where it's got an RTS bolted underneath a giant grand strategic game, I think that pairing goes really poorly together. I'm amazed that series does as well as it does. I don't mean to offend anybody. And I think that they're doing as well as they can with that pairing, and clearly there's an audience for it, and a lot of people are enjoying it. But I think that the barrier to entry comes because that's a challenging pairing. And I have, no room to throw stuff. This is not a moral judgment. I've made lots of challenging pairings in my career as well. It's just an observation of, and good on them that they've been able to get a large audience and retain one over the last couple of decades. But I think it's very stressful for players to, all right, I'm just getting a handle on this giant empire that you've been handed. It's like, okay, now hold that thought, all those thoughts, for 40 minutes or so, and go do this RTS thing. Totally new skill set. Remember everything you were doing. See you in 40 minutes. And it's like the mental strain that goes on players at that point is just really high. So that's what I mean by I'm amazed that series does as well as it does. I don't understand why it does as well as it does. I don't begrudge it. I'm happy for it, but I see it as a happy accident And I feel like if somebody else were to try and match that pairing, they're just going to, like, there are anomalies where you go, that shouldn't work, but it does. That shouldn't be I wouldn't have thought that would be as popular as it is, but people love it. But it's not a repeatable phenomenon. And then there's other stuff where you go, yeah, that makes sense. Doom, okay, boy, we're gonna have some Doom likes coming along because that's the whole thing. Oh yeah, it's first person shooter now. That's a repeatable phenomenon. The Total War series, the AI War series, I don't think that's really a repeatable phenomenon. It works. It works because of some very specific alchemy.
Yep, and there's someone we just did a podcast about a few days ago. We were talking about there is that difference between having someone who is the first one to do something versus the second, third, fourth, fifth.
Yeah.
And when you are the first, you can get away with a whole lot that other developers can't. And also there's the fact that just how many people want to play 5 different Europa Universalis or 5 different AI wars. I mean, look at Slay the Spire is a really good example. That Monster Train, I loved Monster Train. I think it's a better version. But most people stuck with Slay the Spire. And it is very hard, I think, to figure out, what can be repeated in terms of these games.
In business school in general and in business, they talk about the first mover advantage and then the second mover advantage.
Mm-hmm.
Those are 2 separate sets of advantages and challenges. First mover, as you alluded to, essentially gets to set the rules.
Yep.
And but the problem is they have to make up all the rules at the same time. So it's harder, but at the same time they're not held to the same standard. The second mover, so in the event of something that's more simple, I'm going to give you the example of Tripletown. A colleague / friend of mine, Daniel Cook, made that one back a while back, and he's the guy who did the art for Tyrion and a number of other games, and that art is what is in AI War 1, the Tyrion art is, and he built Tripletown, and that's a very cleverly done, straightforward to create game. There's no first mover advantage there, really. I mean, there is some in getting some name recognition of, oh, this new clever thing. But other people, it's simple enough. It's ingenious. Don't get me wrong. It takes forever to come up with a concept like that and implement it the first time. But the second time, when you're copying somebody else, they had it done within a month. And so the second mover advantage, if you can just copy something else that happened and then make it polished, your capital outlay is incredibly lower. There's a curve of complexity of building the thing and the amount of proprietary knowledge that it takes to do it versus that. And so the first mover advantage versus second is higher or lower in there. Slay the Spire, I would say, is somewhere in the middle of that curve. And so it does have room for something like Monster Train to come in and be reasonably successful, but also not displace it. Because they didn't build that in a month. And there was a limit to how much they could polish it and so forth. Versus something like AI War, I knew from the start that was way over on the far end of the scale. Like, we had an enormous first mover advantage. And then when we became the second mover against it, with AI War 2, we actually kind of paid the price of being the second mover in a bad way. Mm-hmm. And honestly, Stardock tried to be the second mover on that with Fallen Enchantress. And they saw that as being kind of an AI War inspired thing. There were a lot of things that were dire about that project, and they've talked about that at length. But one of them is that, they had a diverse set of inspirations, of which AI War was only one. It didn't quite pair well there. Mm-hmm. But so I think it depends on where on the spectrum you are in terms of complexity, as to whether the first or second mover. And then further iterations are, how robust is that core concept. So it's a well studied problem, just not here, not in it's the games are an embryonic industry. I mean, we've hardly been around long enough as an industry to really explore a lot of things. So a lot of times looking to other forms of business that have been around a lot longer, you can find some good parallels.
And yeah, like that's one of the reasons why we've seen so many developers who've been trying to like take these genres and pivot in very different directions so that they kind of capture a different market. Vampire Survivors came out earlier this year and kind of blew everyone away with this. Is kind of like that kind of Crimson Land, was it R.I. Rip kind of arena or score based design, and like no one expected this game to blow up as well as it did. Now we're seeing people trying to copy that one, and it's going to run into that. And I think it's going to run into that same problem of, if one person already strikes gold or strikes oil, and everyone else comes to that same spot, you're not going to get as much. And even at that point, even if you try to do something differently, it's still hard to convey that. And I do think, like, with strategy games in general, that there is room, I think, in the middle. I guess in the way of, if we look at a game like, let's say, like a Fire Emblem, or even something like Sid Meier's Civilization on this side, and a Stellaris, Europa Universalis, or an AI War over here, that if someone can figure out a way of making a more approachable, more, I guess, friendly game, I think there is certainly a spot for that. One of the games I really like was They Are Billions, that try to be kind of like strategy but horde-based defense. And we've seen a few developers trying that or trying to evolve that. And I think the game, again, worked as being like that first attempt at saying, what if we take an RTS and we just, go over there? Like, we're not even going to try and compete with Company of Heroes or Rise of Nations or StarCraft. And I think that's one of the areas where indie devs are really succeeding. I think in the last 5 to 6 years is just saying, what if we don't make a platformer like all the other platformers, or a strategy game, or an RPG?
I think that's where a lot of these new subgenres are coming from too. If you look at MOBAs as a whole, those were strategy games. They're not anymore. What if we took a strategy game, but you only had a couple of characters and you had really specific rules and so forth? And it's actually kind of funny because all the MOBAs follow fairly narrow interpretation of that. The idea of, well, what if you take an RTS game but just a few characters? Does it really need to be 3 lanes based every time? Like, I mean, like the third or fifth or whatever mover could do something other than that and try and capture the same sort of entrepreneurial spirit that the first MOBA had. Same deal with tower defense. Tower defense that was just a thing you did in Warcraft 2. Same as MOBAs were just a mod in was Warcraft 3, I think it was, right? And now they're their own discrete genres, and there's so many different flavors of tower defense. It's been around for 15 years, maybe, I guess, at this point.
Like 2007, 2008, I think, was when LoL or League of Legends came out originally.
Yeah, tower defense is a little bit older than that.
Oh yeah.
So yeah, because Pixel Junk Monsters, I think, was 2006, maybe. So I think it was probably good and established by 2005. But there's all these weird offshoots.
I think I played some things that were very tower defense like as mods of the original StarCraft in 2002, 2003-ish.
Yeah, and Warcraft 2, there was tower defense mods in, I want to say, 98.
Yeah, the first time I played was Warcraft 3. I think that was 1999, maybe 2000, 2001 era.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So, it wasn't clear that this was the start of a new genre to anybody. And at first, this is just kind of a pivot in an existing genre, and then you've got a whole new genre.
Yeah.
And, I would say Souls-like as a concept. It's kind of the same sort of deal because, that's obviously a hot topic for the last since 2008, so 14 years. But I really enjoyed Jedi Fallen Order, which is a quote unquote Souls-like, but it has difficulty levels, and it's a AAA game. It's a story-based game for the most part, but it still has basically bonfires and the death progression and all that sort of stuff, and that kind of watered down progression, watered down interpretation of a Souls-like in what would just be a Star Wars game. Like, 'cause I remember playing like Star Wars. What was that one on the N64? The Star Wars.
Shadows of Empire.
Shadows of the Empire. Yeah. That was like they were positioning that as being actually like a canonical thing between couple of movies for a while there, and that was just a generic action game.
I think they actually wrote a book.
They did
with that story.
Yeah, they did, and then that really seemed like that was going to be like a big deal, and it was going to stick around, and then it just kind of disappeared. I don't know why. Some great music, a lot of great things in that game, but when I look at the history of the Star Wars games in general, they're just kind of, general action games, but with Star Wars flavor. And then when you look at Jedi Fallen Order, it's like, okay, this one has more spark because they took a watered down version of Souls-like. So I'm glad to see things filtering up into the AAA industry from the AA and indie sectors. But I think we're going to see, increasing kind of crossbreeding. But fundamentally, for those of us trying to do something truly original, we need to start with something that's small and approachable, and it can be expanded outwards. And I think that when you look at people who are trying to make the next Total War or the next Civilization, if that means for that company that is in charge of that, if we're talking for Arcen Games, for Civilization, we've got all the baggage of that entire series. And if you go back to Civilization 1, it was not hard to get into. Yeah, you've got the whole world, but it's not like Civilization 6 to get into it. You don't. And so, but you could never give someone Civilization 1 now. So it's this weird historical precedent situation that you get into, because each Civilization game pretty much must include every aspect of everything that every prior one did. We saw what happened to John Schaefer when that was not the case at launch on Civilization 5, and how angry people were until there was 3 DLCs in. And they didn't have religion, they didn't have spying, they didn't have culture, and some of the other things. People were pissed. It was still a good game at launch. It just wasn't everything that Civilization 4 was, plus the new stuff. And, John had been trying to solve some of the bigger problems that Civ 4 had and make it more approachable and all these things. I think those are really good goals, and he did a good job. He got crucified for it.
Yeah, and that's always that challenge when it comes to like working in these long-standing franchises. And I think it's why a lot of the developers like to prefer to work on like, this is my one game like this is my next game like this, and these are completely different things, because that baggage can just really eat up these series. I mean, look at Wind Waker, for instance. When it first came, people were like, "Oh my god, sailing and cell shaded."
Zelda, yeah. Now it's this beloved thing, and it's its own sub-series in Zelda. If they had just launched it as a separate franchise, here's this new cell-shaded adventure game thing with the oceans that we're doing, they would have had no pushback. But because everybody had seen that one demo from Space World in 1998, I guess it was, where they had shown Link and Ganondorf fighting in this dark and gritty style that was what they then had decided they wanted, and eventually that became Twilight Princess. Then, of course, people were like, this is just Green of Time again, but darker. And it's like, there's no pleasing anybody, basically.
Yep.
Or certainly there's no pleasing everybody. Personally, I liked both games. They were fine.
Yeah. And like speaking about like strategy games and kind of, I like the Civilization example because I started my first Civilization was Civ 3,
Mm.
and that was the first time I ever touched a Civ. I remember the only reason I looked up was I saw like the lovely collector's tin on like at EB Games. Like, this looks cool. Let me try this.
Mm-hmm.
Like XCOM, I think is a really interesting example. The original XCOM is considered one of the best games of all time. It's also one of the most unapproachable games of all time. Like it is a nightmare if you want to try and go and play that game. You've never touched it. And then we go, fast forward to Enemy Within by Firaxis, and they basically said we want to make an XCOM for, I think it was like what, 2010, 2011. We're going to remove all this stuff, and people were, I know there are people who are annoyed with it, especially removing time units, but
Yeah.
it turned out like people praised the heck out of that game. And then we saw it with XCOM 2 with like War of the, was it War of the Chosen? Yeah, that was the expansion for XCOM 2. That like that's like a fantastic game, and it really, I think, came with them just like cutting as much baggage of that franchise as one could get. And
You're
then
playing with fire when you do that because you don't know
yeah.
how the customer base is going to react. But and it seems like a lot of extra development time probably goes like, which is more valuable? The name recognition. If you're starting on a new project and it's 2000,
Mhm.
let's say 7, when you're probably really starting on it, do we keep the XCOM name for this game that's old and unapproachable and say this is XCOM 2? Or do we say this is Z Command and this is the spiritual successor to it? And that's what Total Annihilation did to Supreme Commander. And that was a very smooth transition. Supreme Commander 2, in some ways, is more polished than Supreme Commander 1. It's certainly better AI. Various other things are much, much better. I really don't like it because it's not Supreme Commander.
Yeah, that's that challenge.
If they pitched that to me as a new thing, I might like it.
Hmm.
But all I can see when I see Supreme Commander 2 is this uncanny valley of all the things that it's not that I remember it being. That doesn't mean it's not a good game. It's
Hmm.
a very good game, but I can't enjoy it because it's not Supreme Commander 1 plus some gussied up stuff. So it's not a like this is gamers being unreasonable thing. It's just this is human psychology. This is something we all do. This is how it works. If you say hello, I'm XCOM. This is my son XCOM 2. Like you expect a certain something. They got really lucky, or they really knew what they were doing. Probably kind of both.
Yeah.
And versus like System Shock over to Bioshock and stuff like that. That some of these games like the Bioshock series, they made their identity on this is going to be kind of different every time. Bioshock 2, like you change around the protagonists and the antagonists. Bioshock 3, oh, it's called Bioshock Infinite, and you're in the sky, and there's this other stuff. And they still got some flack, but not so much because they had built part of the identity in
Yeah.
being this weird turnover in ideas. And so that worked for them. And, there's so many different strategies you can use, but franchise development and keeping a consistent IP is more dangerous than people want
Yeah.
to let on that it is.
I mean, we could see the same with like Final Fantasy and Kingdom
Yes.
Hearts as well. Like, we're up to what, like 15 different Final Fantasies and the side stories and all that, and they like similar to Mario that they do experiment with their mechanics and systems, but
Mm-hmm.
it gives it like that sense of okay, I enjoy 6, 7, 8. I hate 9, 10, 11. I love 13. Hate 14. Like as a fan, like how do you kind of, I guess, like rationalize or square that circle of I'm a huge fan of this franchise, but only 70% of these games.
Yeah, and I think that works for them
Hmm.
partially because of their marketing budget and their size, and everybody's
Hmm.
willing to give the next Final Fantasy a shot at least.
Hmm.
With Mario, it's a particularly interesting example. I've heard, I forget who said this, it's not me, but it was a really keen observation I felt. They were like, Mario's not a franchise, it's not an IP. It's like a mood. You know what I mean?
Hmm.
And so essentially, not even, I don't think mood was the word they used, but that was what they meant essentially. But it's Mario is a tone. It can be given to a lot of different things, and that's basically Nintendo saying, "Hey, this is going to be approachable and have a certain feel to it, and it's going to be different, whatever it is. Tennis, golf, karting, the next mainline Mario game, the next sub third one, six. They've got like 3D, 2D, all these different variants now. It's all different, but it all has the same sort of mood, and you're there for that mood and that tone
That vibe.
and that vibe exactly." And it goes, okay, that's an interesting approach. You're keeping a vibe, and if I look at the Arcen titles in general, with some exceptions, we largely keep a certain vibe. Tidalis being a big difference, and a few others that are different. And I think, okay, keeping a vibe and keeping a company name. If you think of Kojima, he's always got a vibe. He's known for doing certain things a certain way, but you take him out of Metal Gear, and he's got more to do, and and people are like, "Oh yeah, I want to see Kojima's version of Silent Hills," and it's like, "Yeah, I do too." That
too.
vibe, it's that franchise. That sounds great. Get Guillermo del Toro in there as well. I butchered that name, but
Yeah. And like speaking about Mario and XCOM, look at Mario plus Rabbids Kingdom Battle. It's
yes,
basically
XCOM.
Mario XCOM, and it was a brilliant game. And
It was really fun. My kids were able to play that. It's like, okay,
yeah,
XCOM for my kids. Uh-huh.
yeah,
Sure.
and like we were saying, it's like one of those things. Like this should not work. Like Mario is doing Overwatch shots and Luigi's sniping people, and
Yes.
it's hilarious and it's a great game.
Yeah. And you shove in this weird Rabbids content from the background of background secondary characters from Rayman and what the heck are they doing here? But it works. And it's just like, okay, sometimes it's just lightning in a bottle.
Yeah. And I think like speaking about this idea of like packaging content, one of the things I think I see from a lot of Japanese developers is the idea of having like spin-offs or side stories to their games. If you look at stuff like the Nier franchise, Shin Megami Tensei in particular is a really strong example of that. Like,
I mean, Persona is a spinoff of that, and then you've got Persona Dancing and Persona all the other things. Yeah.
Yep, and again, like they have that ability to kind of say, okay, we're going to try this crazy idea with this game. We're just going to call, Shin Megami Tensei all kinds of words. If you like it, here's this game. If you hate it, well, guess what? Here's the main franchise, completely unspoiled, untouched. You can go play that. And, I mean, one of my favorites was the Strange Encounters one, which is like kind of like an Etrian Odyssey Shin Megami Tensei that came out for the DS, I believe.
Huh.
And yeah, like they can get away with a lot of that simply by saying again that if you want our main franchise, it will stay here. But if you want to see how weird and how far we can go, here's this entire universe of different games.
Yeah, I think that's a much safer approach too. And you're, I think players are willing, to, if there's something they really love and there's something tangential to that, and they're warned by the name and the marketing, this is going to be very experimental, then certain groups, demographics of gamers, I mean, Japanese market is one particularly high example of this, is really, really willing, German ones too, really, really willing to go on some pretty wild tangents. And a lot of the American market is less so. But there are niches within the American market, certainly in the strategy sector, for instance, where they're equally willing. So it's, I think it's a matter of knowing your audience, and I think that their inbuilt, homegrown, Japanese market is so friendly to wild experiments. That's a great advantage that a lot of the Japanese developers have. Which I don't begrudge it to them at all. I think it's wonderful, and I think it's something that lets them do a lot of weird and wild stuff.
Yeah, and again, I think that's always the challenge when it comes to like the baggage when it comes to these major franchises and even to like strategy games, that it's very hard again to sell someone on, let's say, making a strategy game where there is no military, or let's say a strategy game that you're removing these core, or what people consider to be core tenets of the genre. I recently tried the demo for, what was it? I have it on my Steam list. Ozymandias, which is kind of like describes like a 4X game, but without like play like in 20 to 30 minutes.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and you got Off-World Trading Company where there's no combat and it's all and that's Soren Johnson coming straight off of Civ 4. I think that he went straight from that to the other. Maybe there was something else in between. I don't remember.
I know he's working on a new one now.
He's on Old World now.
Yeah, that one. Yeah, and like Old World, I think had that same problem for me, that I loaded up, I'm given, all this information, and I just don't know where to actually focus on. And it's always that like weird, I guess like paradox for a lot of people, that I play Souls-likes like they're my relaxing game. I can turn on Elden Ring or Bloodborne, and I'm into that groove. You give me a game like Total War or Europa Universalis, I am 100% lost. Like, I have no idea where I'm supposed to be looking on the screen.
There's a sizable separate niche, and you wind up with these silos of people who feel that way. Mm-hmm. The way you feel about Souls-likes, they feel about what we might call Civ-likes, even though that's not really a thing. And, when I booted up Old World for the first time and started playing it, my first thought was, wow, nice. Look at all these things that are different from Civ. Oh, that's so much better than that Civ was. Oh, gosh, man. Why didn't they do that before? Jeez, man. Way to go, Soren, And, if I've tinkered with the Total War franchise, but I just skip the real-time battles because I find that overwhelming. And so I instead would just play the grand strategy part of it because I'm more familiar with grand strategy games. I obviously am plenty familiar with RTSs, but that's a really weird sub-flavor of RTS in Total War. And I don't know how many people do that, but the fact that they have very prominently the ability to skip those battles tells you right there that a non-trivial number of their players, need that option. We ran into that with the last Federation, where we had two distinct gameplay modes, and you don't get the totality of people who enjoy both of those. You get the intersection of people who enjoy both of those, or you have people who enjoy one of them, the outer mode, and who want to then skip the inner mode. And you've built all this development time onto the inner mode then. But then once you have a franchise, you can't take away the inner mode without pissing off people who love the intersection. So now you're just stuck. And, momentum is a terrible thing sometimes.
And I think that's a really solid point. And I think it's one of the reasons why we've seen this kind of like splitting or the shard of the roguelike genre over the last 8-9 years. That we have your action roguelikes, you have your deck builders, you have roguelites, you have all these different games, so that if I like system A, C, and E, there's a game for me. If I only like B, D, and E, there's a game for me. And I think that's one of the reasons, I think what you just said there, is why we've seen a lot of developers get away from multiple system-focused games. That, here's your RTS portion, here's your turn-based portion, here's your roguelike portion. Because you have to find that intersection of somebody who wants to play a city builder, but at the same time also wants a roguelike, who also wants a grand strategy game. And that is, a niche within a niche within a niche within a niche.
And it's weird because you have these certain counterexamples. I keep coming back to Fire Emblem Three Houses because it's such a prominent example from the past few years where they said, okay, Normally, there's just some bits of story and stuff in between missions. That's how tactics games work. You have a
Mm-hmm.
mission, it's long, I don't know, half an hour to an hour, depends on the length of the particular mission. And then there's some people who are talking, or you're at a tavern or something, but this is what is happening. And they went, what if it wasn't just this? What if it was Hogwarts? And you were training, what if your soldiers were your students at Hogwarts and you were training them and it was a visual novel? And it's basically this and the equipment screens, but made personal. And that works very well. But somebody might casually look at that and go, oh, you've mashed up the tactics game and a VN. Cool. Let's do that again. And then it's just this disconnected VN and this disconnected tactics game. Why didn't this one work? Huh. What was that about Fire Emblem? It's like, yeah, they just gamified the mechanics they already had. They made the chatting into a visual novel, so it's more interesting. They made your characters on the field into characters who have actual whole full storylines and interpersonal relationships. And they took all the inventory management screens and things, and they made, there's still screens, but they also made it class where you're teaching your students and you have only, and there's calendar months and there's only a certain amount they can learn per time. And so how do you teach them? And it's like, that's freaking clever,
Yeah.
And so they made a one unified system pulling from a few different areas. And if somebody looks at that just a little too surface like, they'll take away the entire wrong lessons from it.
Yeah, and like Fire Emblem is very fascinating. Like for me, like I've never really gotten the Fire Emblem games. I still need to try and find like one of the newer ones to really like dig
I
into.
didn't like any of them until Three Houses, so
Yeah,
I'm with you.
and what you said there, like the story goes that I forget it wasn't Three Houses. I think it was the one before Three Houses where they basically had an ultimatum that if this game didn't sell enough, the whole franchise would have died. And they basically said, okay, let's just, go Hail Mary. Let's do like all the ideas, we thought the fans would hate or people would find polarizing. Let's just put all that into this game. It turned into their best selling Fire Emblem, saved the franchise, and now like that's what Intelligent Systems is known for.
Yeah.
And I mean, we could have had like a completely different universe where they will become blown up for Advance Wars, which I love the Advance Wars games.
Me too. Yeah. Yeah. And you can see the crossover in their thinking about that as well.
And I think that's always that challenge. Like, especially again, like to bring this back to AI War 2, like you have these different expansions that have, fundamentally different units, completely different rule sets, systems, etc. And it's always that challenge of, how much do I rock that boat? We were talking about XCOM a few minutes ago, and the game Phoenix Point popped into my mind. The game by Julian Gollop, who was one of the original designers on XCOM. That he designed Phoenix Point to be kind of like, what if we made the original XCOM for today? And it did not resonate, I think, as well as Firaxis's take. That they tried to, take XCOM, but kind of run it through modern game design sensibilities.
Yeah, that makes sense. And that's, to some extent, what the goal was with AI War 2 as well. But at the same time, the first AI War was such a broad game, which is in some respects similar to XCOM or Total Annihilation. Back then you could just throw a lot of different things at the wall, and especially once you had a core that was working, then you can just add more and more stuff. So we had 6 expansions to the first AI War. The first game was initially pretty small at 1.0 in May of 2009. And then by the time 2.0 ran around with an updated graphics and all that sort of stuff, that was the first version on Steam in October of 2009. It had grown quite a bit. And then the first DLC for it grew a ton. And we had the big 3.0 version and all this sort of stuff. Then we ported it to the Unity engine. And we had another expansion which introduced the Spire in a major way and all this sort of stuff. Actually, we had one expansion before that. But so this is actually our third expansion. And Man, we had people who were like, "I'm never gonna leave the 3.x version. This is not AI War anymore." And because we had to, it had been on this custom engine that I had done in DirectX, and there were some hardware, wrapper extensions and the Direct 3DX extensions that I was using in order to be able to draw that many sprites on the screen, for instance, and Unity couldn't match that, and Keith and I could not figure out a way to get Unity to match that. That was long before things like GPU instancing had been added in, and so there was, at a very low level, we were doing OpenGL programming again. So it was just like the DirectX programming, but minus the nice libraries we'd had, but suddenly cross-platform, which was the goal, and DirectX is not cross-platform, so it's like this. You go round and around in a circle of what is important to you. Well, we're expanding to new platforms, so we're going to lose some of these things that have made it easier. And so we eventually figured out this kind of logic-based thing to let us pretend like we were drawing more icons without actually drawing more icons. We would collapse the ones that, because we discovered that once there was a certain density of icons overlaying each other anyway, you can't see anything in the first place because they're blocking each other. So if you take all the ones that are underneath and just remove them, then you can see better in the first place. And as you progressively zoom in and out, the icons appear and disappear as you would expect. So you have the feeling that all those icons are there, even though most of the time they're really not. And so that wound up being a fairly tidy solution. However, due to some other performance constraints in Unity, we lost like 20% of our CPU throughput. And so we had to reduce unit counts and some other things like that. And just that alone, while still directly porting everything else, you would think 20% unit count loss would not be a big deal. But nobody crucified us, but they were pretty angry.
That describes a lot of RTS games, especially when we kind of saw that move down to smaller unit totals. Like, we look at going from the original StarCraft to StarCraft 2 as an example.
Yes, people were pissed for quite a while. And there's still, there's probably always going to be a life for StarCraft 1 because it's StarCraft 1 and nothing else quite does that.
Yeah, we can see the same thing about Age of Empires as another good example. Like, my friend Thorn, if he's watching this right now, he loves Age of Empires 2, and he plays the enhanced edition of it. And we were trying to play Age of Empires 4, and we're like, yeah, it's okay, but, it wasn't really hooking us. There's always that risk of, again, when you're developing multiple franchises, multiple sequels, of, does the new game kind of, take the cut of the originals? Does it become its own thing so that we have all the hardcore fans of game number 4, all the hardcore fans of game number 2, and oftentimes if you try to do everything, it often just ends up as just this weird mess of systems, and it doesn't really appeal to anyone.
Yeah, Empire Earth 2 versus Empire Earth 1 was a good example of. And that was a change in developer as well, because I forget the name of it. Was it Big Huge Games did the first? I think it was Big Huge Games did the original Empire Earth. And then it was Mad Doc Software who did the DLCs for it. And then they are the one who did the sequel. So you had a handoff between developers to begin with. And that's always risky. But the first game, the sequel to the first game pretty much took everything from the first game, upscaled the graphics, made the performance better, did some other technical stuff that was just like a straight upgrade in a lot of ways. So far, so good. And then instead of having I don't remember the exact details, it was okay, there were 2 resources here, and now it's expanded to 5. Ooh, this is going to be much more fun, right? It's oh my god, none of it's not a play anymore. This is all weird. And if they had not done that, it probably would have been okay. It would have been like the Age of Empires 2 HD version, more or less, but way too soon back then. Age of Empires 2 HD came out 20 years later.
Ooh. Yeah.
So, versus like 4, if at most. So you gotta give it a little more breathing room than that. But
I did look it up. I think it was done by Stainless Steel Studios, who
was it
did
really?
the original Empire Earth. And I know
Big
there's
Huge was something else. Yeah.
yeah,
They
Rise
did
of Nations, and that's one
Rise
of my
of Nations.
favorites.
That's right. Yeah. Yep.
Yeah, and again, it's that challenge of how do you keep growing these things out. We were talking earlier about Mario with a vibe, and like another studio I think really is like similar would be like Clay Entertainment, that all their games are like radically
Yeah.
different, but they all kind of, and this is something that I'm not sure if we spoke about this before, but I know I spoke to other developers about that kind of like studio branding, that studio MO. I think has become a very key aspect of indie developers over the last 10 years. That's not just about being, oh, I'm the guy who made this game, or I made this game. It's about, this is my studio, these are the types of games that I make. So that if you are interested in one game, there's a good chance you may like these other games. And even if it's not a genre that you like, maybe my take on this genre you will like. And
Yeah. I think Clay gets a lot of running out of that.
Mhm.
I think that part of it is they jump so far with each genre that they do, and even back and forth between 3D and 2D sometimes. And I think that when you look at like Nintendo, and if you look at again Mario, they're in a spot like with the Mario Kart sub franchise of Mario that has multiple levels of vibe. It's got the Mario vibe and it has the Mario Kart vibe, and they can't break either. So Mario Tennis or the new Mario skeet shooting, I don't know, whatever it is they do next, Mario truffle hunting, whatever it is, they get to make up their own vibe as long as it fits with Mario. But if it's Mario Kart, they're now doubly constrained. Clay has never really run into that because they've jumped really far each time, DLCs aside. I think that I don't remember the name of the developers, but the ones who did Sunless Sea and then Sunless Sky, they run into the same sort of challenge of the Mario Kart franchise. Of not only is it the developers' vibe, but it's also this franchise's vibe. And they kind of broke the vibe a little bit, going from Sunless Sea to Sunless Sky. Some people don't dig it. Some people do. I actually really like Sunless Skies. And I think it's a much better game in every respect. But then some people are just like, Sunless Sea. When you look at AI War and AI War 2, we did the same thing. We broke the vibe of AI War in certain ways, in the same sense that Sunless Skies broke the vibe from Sunless Sea. And I think AI War 2 is demonstrably a better game, but you're forever going to have some people who like the original game who are just never going to be on board. Same with XCOM versus Enemy Unknown. Different studios, obviously, there, and long time differential. But, you make your choice, and then you have to be okay with it.
Yep.
And sequels are tricky business. I don't know that I want to do another one. I would be much more interested in a spiritual successor, because then you get to define the vibe. If the Nintendo team said, we're making a new Mario Driving, and it was like, this is Mario Driving 1, and it's, F1 racing or something with Mario, they can do whatever they want. It doesn't have to have the Mario Kart vibe at all. It just needs to have the Mario vibe. And suddenly their creative space is really wide open. They can do something really interesting. If they tell you Mario Kart 9 is coming, you know what that's going to be.
Yep.
If they say Mario Driving is coming, you have no idea what that's going to be. Knowing those guys, it could be anything. And probably be a lot better than Mario Kart 9.
Yep, and again, like, that's that challenge of how you have to, like, how your audience is going to evolve with you and your company. If you look at someone like Daniel Mullins with all the games he has, from Pony Island to Inscription that came out, they are completely different games, but they all again fit that branding or vibe that he's developed. And
Yeah.
I think what you said about kind of that, like breaking the vibe from AI War One to AI War Two, is a very interesting point because it's something that we hear from like a lot of like very, I guess, like traditionalists when it comes to like their genres. That if you change one thing, this is not my genre anymore. I don't care what you do with it. And I think this is an issue that indie developers are, I think, right now, maybe even the last few years, have had to kind of push forward with is, do we try to make our games more appealing? Do we try and figure out how do we take a game like AI War and make it for someone who's never played it? Or do we just say, this is our game. Like, this is for this specific audience. If you don't belong right here, this game is not for you. And there are obviously pros and cons of both approaches.
I think the market's going to eat anybody
Mm-hmm.
who doesn't make a game that's quickly accessible now.
Yeah.
We're spoiled for choice now in a way. There's hyper competition in this market now. That was not the case when AI War 1 came out. It wasn't the case when The Last Federation came out. There was healthy competition, but there wasn't hyper competition. And at this point, I know that Amazon, their executives, when they were talking about their new new shows they're greenlighting for like the Jack Ryan series or whatever, they're looking at stuff and they said our biggest competition is not Hulu or Apple TV or whatever. Our biggest competition is Fortnite because everything is competing for people's attention, and you can't look at that in isolation. And Fortnite is we're not after Fortnite's audience, so we're not competing with Fortnite. We're also not competing with Netflix either, because again, just not as much of an overlap. People who are after our stuff are after a certain thing. They want to use their brain in a certain way to a certain intensity. They want to get a certain feeling. We're just not in competition with other media that way. So that's very useful for us because we have an identity of that sort. But for something that strays a little more towards passive entertainment, or like an RPG that's just kind of more laid back, you're in competition with novels and movies and all the other things, because this part of your brain that you're using is very similar. You're not necessarily playing an RPG in order to have the most stimulatingly difficult chess-like experience you've ever had. We're in competition with Chess Club or Sudoku puzzles, or whatever else comes out, the morning crossword.
Yeah.
And so understanding your space and understanding, okay, within that space, what else is there, and what is the competition like? So you brought up platformers. We've done platformers as well. And everybody does a platformer now. That wasn't always the case, but that is now the case. And once upon a time, I felt like and I know a lot of people did, I felt like younger listeners are going to laugh at this, but the 2D platformer genre died. It disappeared for about a decade. It was gone. Everybody went to 3D, and as we all hopefully know, with a few exceptions aside, 3D platformers not so good. First person certainly not. A few exceptions, but third person ones. I mean, the Mario series has done it very well. Most have not done it. Then we got into like the 2.5D ones, and a few other things, but that's pretty recent. That's in like the last decade plus a little. So last time I made a platformer, it was not in a hyper competitive environment. And now, if you want to make a platformer, you have to understand, okay, well, somebody who's after a platformer probably is looking for a skill challenge. they're looking for certain kind of frustration versus dopamine cycle that they're going to have happen. So again, you're not in competition with Netflix, probably not in competition with Fortnite. This is much more rapid turnaround. If you make a really slow, contemplative platformer, you're probably going to have a bad time. You get something like Inside or Limbo, which is obviously prior to that. Those are not platformers. They have the form of a platformer, but they're not a platformer. And that's where you have to understand yourself as a developer, like, what is it you're making? Okay, this is in the form of a platformer. So people immediately understand you can jump, you move to the right, fine. But this is not a platformer. This is some sort of weird existential horror puzzle game, more or less. And it's a story, but it's also an interactive one. It's like this weird interactive painting that you can't get in any other medium. So, okay, yeah, a certain amount of people are on board for that. There's an audience for that, and it's not hyper competitive suddenly because there are not very many games that do that. So when we get overly reductive with, Inside, I guess, is a platformer. Is it though? So
go finish your thought.
No, that's it. Basically, it's just a matter of we're getting increasingly, the slices are getting increasingly small. You need to give somebody some familiarity. Oh yeah, I can play Limbo. I know how to push to the right and push the jump button. Get it immediately. Geez, what's this giant spider after me? You know what I mean? Like, that's not in Mario. And so platformers are easier to talk about because they're very mechanically simple. In strategy games or other complicated genres, all the same challenges apply. You need to give people something they're mechanically familiar with and then do something off the beaten path. We go, mechanically, that's an RTS. Spiritually, though, is it? No, not really. Because if it is, you probably are in trouble. Because somebody bigger can do it better.
Yeah. A lot of really good points there to kind of build off of. Like, as you said, like, attention spans, I think that's one of the biggest things that's changed, from 2010, 2012 to where we're at today, that there's 40 to 60 games being released weekly. There's probably a good 15 games coming out daily these days. If your game doesn't hook me within 30 seconds of loading it up, I have an entire list of new releases on Steam that I can go for. And I think there's always that argument, again, especially with games like what Arcen puts out, that when you do occupy those specific niches, like Paradox, like like Supergiant with Hades, or even just traditional roguelikes, you do get away, I think, with that idea that, okay, if you're buying my game, you're buying it because you are a fan of X. But
how do you know you're going to like a complicated game? Yep. How many hours are you willing to put into it? If it takes you 5 hours to learn the game and it's somebody you never heard of, are you going to risk that in a market where you're saturated for choice? No.
Exactly.
But if it's a Paradox title and you know you like Paradox titles, sure, fine. It takes me 20 hours to learn it. I know I'm going to like it, if that's your bag. If you're not sure, well, it's self-limiting, their customer base, but it's fine because your customer base is large enough for them to do quite well. So you can take one of two approaches. Either you take, here's your market segment, and it will grow slowly and not very organically. It's just going to, grow as more people age into it, probably. Or you can aim for the broader market and have a new segment that you create for just your own specific thing, but it's trading on your company vibe, and that is, like the Clay approach, and that's more the Arcen approach, but we've been all over the place, honestly. Clay has been more consistent. They're a better example.
Yep, and it's hard to kind of, again, keep and maintain that, especially if you're trying to grow this game. And I mean, this is something we've seen from many indie developers who have struggled with that kind of next game. What do I do? Do I make the bigger version of the game that succeeded? Do I go in this completely opposite direction? Do I just take the old game, maybe shine it a little bit and say, here's my brand new game? And there's no, I think, real right answer to it because, again, your audience is going to be very different depending upon what you've built your studio on. Like, there are some people who are fine with playing, game A that's exactly like game B, which is exactly like game C, which is exactly like game D. And then there's people who are like, if I play game A and your next game's like it, I'm done. Like, I don't want to play the same exact game.
Well, it's like Spiderweb Software.
Yeah.
For a long time,
Oh, yeah.
their first 6 with the Vernum games, like they're like identical mechanically.
Yep.
But what he did was he made them really rich stories, and so he built a framework, and then he told a story within that framework, and that was a good thing for the audience. So from one perspective, each game is the same pretty much. And that's very frustrating if you look at it from that perspective. Bad dev. If you look at it from another perspective, here's this rich series of, they're very well written games that are interactive,
Mm-hmm.
and they're all using one underlying thing. Very smart, very good. Yay, rah rah, And so you get a very divided opinion based on who you ask. And that's fine. You're never going to get universal acclaim or appeal. If you're able to find enough of an audience to pay the bills for whatever your size studio is and whatever your personal needs are, where you live in the world, all those different things, you're good to go.
Mm-hmm.
Do what you like.
And I think what we've seen from these kinds of lightning in a ball moments are games like Elden Ring. That one of the pervading thoughts I hear, or that's been kind of coming up with Elden Ring, is that people didn't want to play these long games, these 40, 60, 80 hour long epics. But
and here's one that's 120 hours. Yeah, no problem.
Yeah, it's a game that you think the map is this big, and then becomes this big, and then becomes this big, and then it's this big.
Yeah.
And
yeah, I know.
And again,
but it just goes to show the moment to moment has to be compelling enough, and if it is, pull you along. And but at the same time, you do maybe should end a little bit sooner than Elden Ring does, as you and I have discussed, privately, where it's like, that first 60 hours was amazing. The next 20 was okay. The next 20 was not as fun, and then I just stopped at 100, and I was like, man, I wish I'd stopped at 60, and I wish I could have seen the ending then. But you go on the Elden Ring subreddit and say something like that, they'll lynch you. I mean, they are just absolutely, they're like, what? I'm in New Game +6 now. I've got 700 hours or whatever in this
all
game.
my stats are level 99. And what's...
I know, right? Yeah, and so it's like, okay, I got my money's worth out of this game. I had a really good time for a long time. At some point, I said, that's enough for me. I'm not having fun anymore. I'm going to do something else. But at the same time, in the back of my mind, I'm like, I could go back to it, though. I don't want to right now. But in a year from now, I probably will. And I'd be able to maybe finish it. So who am I to criticize if the core fan base is really happy and I have this weird option to kind of go back and do it? I would have been more satisfied, me personally, and I know you too as well, Josh, if they had ended it sooner. But I can't say they were wrong. And I don't just mean for monetary reasons. I mean for customer satisfaction reasons as well. Obviously monetarily they were very right. But from a core customer satisfaction thing, it seems like they're really doing a good job there. So I'm reluctant to criticize, even as I criticize.
Yeah, I gotta make my video about why I think it's the best, worst Souls-like, and I'll post it on the Elden Ring Reddit. I'm sure that will go over really well over there.
I will send you flowers in advance.
Yeah. Let's see. In chat, I think to Star Dragon's comment about that people are accepting to different games if they're well made. I think this again gets at kind of this topic, or as we talk about in terms of presenting games. One of the reasons why studios like Nintendo, like Clay, can get away with very vastly different designs, in a way can often seem off-brand, is the fact that they approach it with that same kind of philosophy, that same kind of mood they're trying to generate. So that, again, if you hate deck-building roguelikes, or if you hate colony sim games, but if you like Clay, you may get something out of Auction Not Included or Grifflins. Does that mean it's the perfect game? No, of course not. But it does give that sense of, again, like that kind of like studio branding that we've been discussing.
Certain minimum level of quality that you expect from these companies, and that's pros and cons. You expect some weirdness in certain areas of, Nintendo's online always sucks, right? Or, there's various criticisms you can make of Arcen kind of perennially, or of Clay perennially as well. I'll spare saying those. But okay, there's going to be at least these little bitty weirdnesses, maybe. But there's also a certain bar of quality that's going to be hit. And if I'm okay with those weirdnesses and I'm okay with that quality, I'm in.
So, two questions I want to ask you guys. And first, as a quick time check, we are about an hour and a half into the overall recording. So I just want to see how everyone's doing. Is everyone still like have fluids and the energy to keep going?
I should probably bow out pretty soon, but I can't speak for Chris.
I'm doing all right. We need to give Willard more of a chance to expound on his areas here, though. I've been dominating things more than... We've been bouncing around a lot of areas that are more wide-ranging, I think, which is good, but it's not necessarily as directly Willard's area.
Yeah, and I think that kind of takes me to this question that I want to ask both of you. And I also want to get the chat's opinion as well, because I know we have a lot of strategy game. We have a lot of Arcen fans in the chat as well, saying how great it is to see you guys too. So here's the question. I want to go back to the idea of onboarding and presenting, because I think this is something that definitely fits with AI War 2 and with strategy games in general. For both of you, and for the chat as well, what do you think is the hardest ask to kind of teach a new player in a game like AI War, or in any kind of like very complicated game? Like for me personally, I always have a tough time making that connection between, if I do this, this happens. So why do I do this? Like, again, you can teach me, okay, click this, do this, move over here. I still don't know. I think making that connection from these different things has always been like the hardest ask of me.
Yeah, I mean that fits pretty well with my experience in terms of getting people to engage with certain systems. To say, oh, I have this need in a game where I need certain things, and I need to engage with a particular system to get those things. Like for the Necromancer, which is what I've been working on a lot. I gave it new resources and new sort of things you have to do to get those resources, and they will let you do new things. But like getting people to say, oh, if I need X for a power increase, here's the system I engage with, and here's what I have to do with it. And I had a lot of problems with the last round of alpha testers trying to say, hey, I feel like I'm really lost all the time, and so what we wound up doing was putting in a whole bunch of little text reminders like, oh, you need X, here's a documentation for X, here's a documentation for Y, to make it easier for them to engage with it. That said, I do still... so this is going back to something Chris said earlier about giving a good vertical slice early. The Necromancer isn't as complex as the human faction you typically play as, but it still comes in with too much baggage right at the start, and I couldn't find a way to reduce here you need all of these things at the very beginning, and the very first thing that I had, you didn't get those things, and it was too slow. Because if I say, oh, you need to wait to get powerful enough to have all your toys, people will lose interest because they need their toys quickly.
And if you give them the toys too fast, then it's a case of, what do I do with all these toys? You give me...
Yeah, you're either overwhelmed or bored, and like, we found something that works. It's not... Like, I would still like to have found a different solution that let you still start slower, but we didn't, and it seems to be pretty good.
Yeah.
Yeah. I think it's, for a DLC, we get some leeway because we've got a built-in audience to some extent. I think I would people are projecting constantly when they come to a new game. And if you think about boss design in a general game, if there's a boss that just suddenly stabs you out of the blue, people get very angry about that, right? Because it didn't telegraph its move. You're supposed to have some sort of wind up that shows you what to expect. And okay, that's a very easy axiom of boss design in video game parlance. That's not news. But what has been striking me is that it's much the same when you're first encountering a game, period. What does Limbo, as an example, telegraph is going to be in this game when you first encounter it? I mean, you walk a little ways and there's like a box and you're like, okay, so I guess there's going to be physics puzzles. You walk a little bit further and it's actually kind of boring for a bit. And then they give you a spider that is much bigger than other contemporary enemies in games up till that point. Normally enemies were like this big on the screen, spiders like this. That was unusual. You're like, oh, this is going to be scary. I'm going to see stuff I haven't seen before. And that has now been telegraphed even after the spider's gone. And so players are willing to go along for a ride. When we're introducing a new mechanic, so I've run into this with a number of different 4X games that I've seen played, or that I've played as a player, but then also ones that RTS games that I've developed, where if we have a bunch of different resources up at the top and we hide all the ones that are not relevant until you're able to play, people assume that's all there is. There's no telegraphing that there will be more, don't worry, And in Elden Ring, they're intentionally telegraphing this is big, but really not that big. It's probably just pretty much Limgrave. Oh, and, Caelid or something. And then that little, the Weeping Peninsula, that's about all there is, I guess. There's something up there above Stormvale Castle, but you're probably about done by then.
Yeah.
And it's, and it turns out that that's like 10% of the map. And you're like, geez, I don't know if I would have gotten into this if I knew this was just, this is like 4 open world games stacked on top of each other. Are you kidding me? But by the time that they reveal that to you after telegraphing, oh, this is big, but not that big, I was like, it's kind of disappointing, actually. This is kind of that small. But, this is cool, though. I'm having fun. Yeah. And then, so I think they were very intentional in telegraphing. And I think that most developers, including Arcen, historically, are very... That's not what we're thinking about. We're not thinking about what are we telegraphing from the early on in. And so when you say, I don't understand, I understand this to here, I understand mechanically what you just told me. Why? Why do I care? If we're not telegraphing that something cool comes, you're going to be able to do something smart with that later. That is one of the geniuses of Portal and why that game carries you through all the way. People remember just the high points, but actually each level has entirely new game mechanics every time. So you're constantly telegraphing to you that there's going to be something new in the next room, and they never lie. People remember it as being this game about portals, but it's actually a game with 18 distinct puzzles in there. And then you wind up with all these other games that are built in the spirit of Portal, and they actually do only have one mechanic. And those don't hold your interest for as long as Portal did.
Yeah. Another, I want to get back to I War 2 as well, but like another quick example would be like Factorio and Dyson Sphere program that
they telegraph very well.
You start out, click on a coal mine, hit the pickaxe for 10 minutes. Okay, now I build a power supply. Now I build an automated drill. Now that drill does that 10 minutes of work for me in seconds. I take that, I go over here.
And those games on the main menu show you a factory that you cannot possibly imagine constructing when you enter the game. That's their very first vision to you, assuming you've never seen a trailer. Here's a factory you cannot possibly imagine building. Now here's not much. you really have very little to do. I'm manually doing this. Are you kidding me? Am I gonna be drilling
Mm-hmm.
coal for the rest of the game? Nobody really thinks that because they've been given the vision of the factory already on the main menu or from a trailer, and so they're willing to go along for the ride of, okay, I understand. You're showing me the tiniest
Yeah.
nugget of what is to come.
Yep. And again, it's all about how you present this. If you load up Factorio and they give you every single thing on this massive
Never be able to
UI,
play it. Yeah.
I would run in the opposite direction. But they start you off with this much, and then becomes this, and this. And I think, again, like, that's that sole brilliance of games like Factorio, like Elden Ring, that moment-to-moment gameplay, I feel, is, I think, lost on a lot of strategy, grand strategy, 4X-style games, because they are very much about, here's everything, try and figure this out. But again, if you don't have that knowledge base, or even if you played a real-time strategy game, you go from playing, like, Command and Conquer to Solaris, none of those skills
jump.
really translate.
Yeah.
So
we're going to be taking a different approach
mm-hmm.
In future titles based off of what we have learned. But trying to go for the same sort of depth, but going for that vertical slice, properly telegraphing, properly, eking things out, trying not to have overt tutorials in the same sense, but just gamifying learning,
And I think that's what I really like about Skyward Collapse. I remember we had that interview a few years ago, that Skyward Collapse is very self-contained as a turn-based or like a 4X strategy game. Mm-hmm. And it really didn't play like anything else because of that. What was it? The John Schaefer's last game, the one that he did the Kickstarter at the Gates.
Enemy at the Gates, yeah.
At the Gates is also very similar to that. And I think, again, like, that's where I think a lot of developers have that wiggle room in terms of figuring out, how do we present this in a way that, if you've never played these games, you can enjoy the first turn of this game, or like 10 turns, or you can enjoy 75 to 500 turns. You're still getting that sense of momentum. I think that's always been lost on me when I try to play AI War, and the same thing for some of the later Civilization games, is that, I build a unit, I build a city, I don't see the connection of how this is going to move 75, 500, 1,000 turns down the line. In a game like Elden Ring or a Souls-like, I get sword, I slash enemies, I get stronger. Now I wear better armor. Now I get better stuff. Now I go from fighting little guys in the field to market, to then Godric, to dragons. And there you can track that progression. You can see how somebody goes from start to finish. You don't get, I think, that same feeling and that same flow when you play a grand strategy game, where you just start somewhere and you don't know where it's going to go in the next how many hours you're going to play.
In fairness, if you go back to the original Dark Souls, I started playing with Demon Souls, but and I didn't really like Dark Souls. I really liked Demon Souls, and I didn't care for Dark Souls. I'm a weirdo. But when you get into Dark Souls at the start, with Demon Souls, it's very much clear that you're trying to stay alive, and that this is what you're supposed to do. I mean, that's telegraphed in a whole bunch of different ways, and it cuts your health in half when you die, and there's all these different things. It's a very punitive game. It's also clear, so it's clear this is going to be punitive, and this is going to be try to live. Okay, I get that, and I'm engaged. Dark Souls lost me because it's the opposite of that. It is, you're supposed to die again and again and again and again and again and again and again, and you're supposed to get good. And that was a social message passed by word of mouth from players. That was a viral concept that happened. It's not in the game proper. It doesn't convey that directly. And so that's where this could have been a different turning point in history in a lot of ways of these genres, because if Dark Souls had not been this viral hit and people hadn't built up this new gamer vernacular where they know what to expect. Oh, this is long. This isn't just a few things, because you don't know how long is Dark Souls. You don't really know when you're going into it, right? And is this like the final boss that I'm fighting right now? What the heck is happening? Like, there's a lot of context that's not there. In fact, they're known for being obscure. I think part of the popularity of Elden Ring is that you can come to it kind of blind, and it telegraphs everything that you're supposed to know. Like, you go up to the castle and it kicks your butt, and you're like, that's not fun. I'm not good enough. But there was all this other place I saw. I'm going to go over there. And so you do. And so that works very well. I feel like Dark Souls, it's earned its reputation, don't get me wrong, but at the same time, it was also sort of a fluke. And it was, Elden Ring is not a fluke. Elden Ring is designed and telegraphs things properly the full way through. Dark Souls was more experimental.
Yep, and again, like, I know we've done had this conversation about you can't just go from Demon Souls to Elden Ring. Just like how you can't go from Super Mario Brawlers to Super Mario Odyssey. It takes a studio to grow, to evolve, and to, again, understand what their design is. Because if
they spent a decade deconstructing what they're doing, and that's why they were able to build Elden Ring. Yep. So it's not a criticism of Dark Souls per se. I mean, it is in a literal sense, but it's not they should have known better. Like, no, they shouldn't have. Like, they were treading new ground. They did great. But it was, and then they got really lucky on top of that, and I'm glad for them. And then they used that luck and that knowledge over a decade to build their magnum opus, which has its own problems and all the things, but it doesn't really matter. They learned.
Yep. And it's why, again, like, it's so tricky to understand these underlying systems when it comes to these titles. You mentioned platformers earlier, and what you said about, difference between a game that has jumping and a difference between a platformer, that's pretty much in my game design deep dive book. And there's a plug for you watching. Go buy my game design deep dive books for more stuff about genres. And yeah, again, it's that very big challenge. And I know, Willard, since you have to go in a few minutes, I do want to at least talk to you a little bit more about the expansion to AI War 2. One of the things that we were saying a few minutes ago about how you, I guess, package new content and how DLCs and expansions, I think, are a very interesting shorthand for it, is that it kind of allows you to, separate, this is our main game from these different systems. With the expansion that you worked on for AI War 2, I guess, what was kind of the challenge of, how, I guess, quote-unquote, weird can we make this expansion while still keeping it, I guess, like, on brand with AI War 2?
He's been integral to all three, by the way.
Okay.
But I just wanted to point that out before he answers.
Yeah, so the biggest thing that wound up in DLC 3 was this ability to play as this necromancer faction that goes and kills stuff and transforms it into its own units. And the genesis of this was actually, I wanted a simpler mode of the game that I could play with my father in multiplayer. So it originally was just, somebody's going to play as the zombies. Because when you kill stuff, you can get NPC zombies that just wander out and will shoot your enemies like... they're just a little bit helpful. It was like, okay, can I make something that's a lot simpler for this, just for my family's multiplayer session? And this, eventually, people looked at this and said, wow, this is actually really fun. Can we make it more so? And it turned from just a very simple thing into a full, like, you could just play the game entirely as this and omit all of the other systems that you have. So, like, in a way, it was very interesting because it just sort of grew very organically from, here's this little concept that wasn't even intended for a broad audience to, we actually really like it. How do we make it bigger? So that was a very, that is an unusual way of answering that question, because there was already an existing thing that people thought was fun, and we just wanted to build on that. So, like, that's my answer for the third expansion. The answer for the second expansion is all of the stuff that's in it is basically optional, and it's adding new factions that will dramatically impact the game. Like, There's a faction of Dark Zenith that will show up and do a full galaxy invasion with their own planets and their own giant ships. So that was it's very different in terms of what it brings to the game. So the third expansion is smaller factions but new ways of playing as you the player. The second expansion was more, here are new things for you the player to interact with, but you don't get to control them in any way. So like depending on which expansion you look at, you get very different answers to that. Like, what is it bringing that's new? It's a very different set of things depending on which expansion you look at.
The first expansion is kind of cut down the middle in a lot of ways in terms of some new ways for you to play and some new antagonists as well. So that's kind of an interesting thing because we started out kind of cut down the middle with some of this, and then the following two ones really went heavy in one direction or the other.
Yeah, it's also worth noting that the first expansion, the two big things in that, the Scourge and Playing as the Fallen Spire, were Kickstarter things. They were stretch goals from the Kickstarter, so we just had to put those in someplace. So like we sort of lucked is the wrong word, but we got both of those sort of elements because that's what people wanted going in is, I want to play a different way with your Spire allies, and I want new enemies to have to worry about, which was the Scourge. Mm-hmm. So, like, we had the blueprint for that from the Kickstarter at the very beginning.
Mm-hmm. The Fallen Spire campaign was in the first AI War as well, but that was in the fourth expansion for the first AI War. And it was a fan favorite, so people had wanted that to come back in some fashion. But we don't want to just do the exact same thing again. So it was a matter of how we can take the spirit of that and reimagine that in a way that is more serially replayable. And then the Kickstarter promise was really for the Nemesis, which was really just going to be this one ship that was harassing you. And we kind of already had something like that. By that point in development, we'd built Willard built the Devourer Golem, which he was in the first AI War, but he ported it over to AI War 2 and made it more interesting. That was just in the base game. And it's still not that interesting, which he noticed. I'll let you tell that story.
Technically, the answer is Keith brought the Devourer Golem over.
Did he?
And then that was like the one faction that he like, and I've never really messed with it too much because it's very simple. That's all that it does. What I made was the macrophages, which is sort of takes some of the ideas of the Devourer Golem, but it gives them more of a life cycle. And like they're out getting resources and bringing them back, and they make more of themselves over time. And yeah, the notion of taking stuff from the original AI War and making it more interesting, like that happened to almost all of the factions that were in the original game release. Like we had the Astro Trains from the original game, done completely differently. We had the Marauders from the first game, again reimagined for this new game, and a lot of that was that we had a better engine that allowed us to make those things. But yeah, we did a lot of mining the first game for like, here's a concept, we know people like that concept, what can we do to expand it and make it more interesting, and like what's a thing that when you play it the first time you're like, oh, I wish I could do that would be cool if it could do that, because the second game's engine will pretty much let us do whatever it is we wanted. We could figure out a way to do it.
Mm-hmm. Critically, also, we skipped all the things that we had tried and burned with in the first game, because the first game had a lot of ideas and a lot of different content, and some of it really did not resonate well with players. Defender mode is a good example. It was like, we're never bringing that to the second one, because everybody was asking for something along those lines, like a smaller thing where you just kind of defend for a little while, and it's ostensibly simpler and interesting, and then I couldn't even get anybody to playtest this thing in the first game, really. And so it's just like, well, okay, that's out, and nobody cares, so we're going to focus on content that they do care about. Mm-hmm. I think that the Scourge that Willard had worked on in DLC 2 was yet another evolution in a lot of ways of the devourer to macrophage concept. In some ways, the nemesis that was described in the Kickstarter was supposed to be kind of a souped up devourer, like this big old scary planet thing that like is chasing you and is your greatest enemy. But it became really apparent to both of us that any single unit doing something along those lines was not really going to be that interesting. And so it morphed into, faction with an even more complicated life cycle that Willard put together. And that was actually the timing where he came up with a whole new branch of AI for the game. It got backported in a bunch of other factions, and a bunch of factions use it now. But
it was basically there was no logic in the game to allow for small units of enemies to coordinate and hit targets effectively. So what I did was say, all right, if I was the bad guys, what would I want to be able to do? And then I tried to turn my thinking into game logic, which is, on the one hand, turned out quite effective. On the other hand, it is kind of limited by how good I can strategize and come up with ideas. And that was one of the things that that I found frustrating eventually, is I couldn't think of things for the AI to do in certain circumstances. Like, it didn't matter how smart they were. The human players could always come up with situations that I couldn't figure out what the right move for the AI was. And at that point, it's like, well, it's not going to get any smarter, because we would need to do much more replumbing in order to make it possible for the AI to be smarter.
I think we hit an interesting point, though, honestly, where I think you're underselling yourself a little bit, because we hit a point where the AI could reliably kill players, but it wasn't any fun. Do you know the one I'm talking about?
Oh, yes.
This gets back to a question that Josh had from earlier in the podcast of, do people really want a smarter AI? And here's where the answer is no. They do want it generally, but not this way.
So what wound up being figured out was the smartest thing for the AI to do was to take all of its ships that it was going to be using for an attack and hide them somewhere where the player couldn't see them. And then when it got powerful enough to just run over the player, then it would just show up and kill you. So
it's
you would go
absolutely fair. It's totally fair.
Yeah.
Like that was the smartest thing. Like, all of the logic that I wrote to try to be smart eventually turned into, we're just gonna hide for the player until we can one tap you, and then we just go.
And that's what if you look at like a competitive Korean MMO or RTS, not MMO, what I'm saying, but like if you look at like a competitive Korean RTS, that is, in some respects, that would be like a valid meta you could see happening, right? Between advanced players, you maneuver until such a time as you then just overwhelm in one move, and everything's maneuver until it's killing blow. From the player's perspective, especially from a not world-class RTS player perspective, just your average person, or people better than Willard or I, but still not world-class, they're playing, and they're not seeing much, and then they suddenly die.
Mm-hmm.
That's their experience of it. It's like, oh no, if you'd scouted more, you'd have known they were out there. And there's a little tally up there that's getting awfully dangerous. And they're like, yeah, but that's not fun. It's like, we want to actually fight. Like, there's no action. Like, it's smarter to not.
The build-up forces then crush your opponent approach is much more okay in a symmetric game. But because the game is already asymmetric, at that point, the answer might as well be, the AI just spawned 10,000 ships and killed you.
Yeah.
Because you haven't gotten to engage with that system. It wasn't, we were talking about telegraphing, it wasn't telegraphed that this was going to happen, and now you just die.
Yeah. And that's the same thing I was talking about with my issues with a lot of strategy games. I make these three decisions, something happens and I have no idea how it happened. I can't equate, how these three decisions led to this. And then I'm just left there sitting there and, well, I hit a bunch of buttons, I lost. Do I reload this game back up and get confused, or do I move on to another game?
That's one of the things that AI War 2 is incredibly better at than any of our prior strategy titles, at least, is, and I don't know the last time you played it, Josh, because it has gone through so many iterations, but really in the last year, it's had a major, major shift. And one of the things we did, it's a much easier game than the first one in the default mode. We wound up having to introduce campaign types because we started alienating some of our core players because some of the simplicity that we were starting to drive towards to try and make it clear to players who are newer, what is happening and why am I losing, all this sort of thing, right? It made for a lot of power creep on the player side, and the advanced players are going, what's up with this? I'm just rolling the enemy, and this has gotten too simple. But the new players are going, I love this. But our biggest fans are going, I'm really kind of you're losing me here. So we're like, damn, we have to split this, basically. So we wound up splitting it, and then splitting it again, and splitting it again. So now we have sandbox mode. The main mode is Humanity Ascendant, which is, you're a little on the powerful side. Then there's a challenger mode, which is like, you want to, you have some victories under your belt, and you're ready to have certain things, certain props, kind of removed from you that you might fall over with. And then we've got expert mode, and then we had to add in a logistician mode, which is basically, do you want those? I gave the example of Empire Earth and the sequel, how it has, like instead of 2 resources, it suddenly has 5. Well, Logistician does that, and I don't like it. But some of our fans really do, and it solves some certain problems in the really advanced meta for that subset of players. So, Logistician, there you go. And then we have one called Death Wish, where it's just like you really had to have one to play that one. But yeah, so there's a mode for everybody, and it comes down to accessibility, because these aren't difficulty levels. We have those; are separate. These are more like accessibility levels, and so Humanity Ascendant is a lot more accessible. And you can crank the difficulty up. It only goes as high, there's still difficulty 1 through 10, but difficulty 10, Humanity Ascendant, is just not as complicated as expert mode because it's more accessible.
And I think that's where I think that's kind of like where the market has really changed on the kind of games they consume these days, is that people want to load up a game and they want to enjoy it. They don't want to spend 5 to 10 hours reading tutorials, watching videos, looking up Let's Plays. But you still want to have, as we said earlier, about you want those, you want that breadcrumb trail to, okay, you've done this, now we can go over here, and now we go over here. And I can tell you, I think it's been at least, 2 years since I touched AI War 2. So it will definitely be
different.
Yeah. And that actually takes me to a question I want to ask both of you. This is a really good strategy game, even just, again, like with AI War 2's development in general. And it's the idea of, I guess, what is the true game? And what I mean by that is whenever we see strategy games that have lots of DLC, lots of expansions and patches, there's always, I think, we used the term baggage earlier, and I think there's always this baggage for new players in terms of, how do I get started? And again, this even, links back to packaging and the presentation, that I, as a new player, let's say I buy AI War 2 for the first time, I see all these different modes, I see all these different previews of DLCs, and I see a kid jumping on Chris's shoulder there. You see all these expansions, and you're just going, okay, how do I begin? Maybe I got this game for, off a Humble Bundle. Maybe someone gifted it to me, but now I see here's $20 more of expansions. Anno 1800 is a good example for me. I have played maybe 5-6 hours of that game, which is like nothing in terms of anno time. But I keep waiting for them to say, okay, we're done with the DLC. But they went year 1 to year 2. Now they're doing year 4. And it's that case of when do I start playing? When do I get the green light to actually play this game?
You want to start, Willard, or do you want me to start?
Sure. I mean, I think the easiest way to get in is we have a bunch of quick starts that are like, here's a simple scenario. You don't have to look at the game lobby. The game lobby has a million options. You know, you open it. There's dozens of like 2 dozen factions or something like that. There's some quick starts that are like helping hands quick starts where it's you and a faction that's just an ally for you against a not particularly smart AI, though if it's your first time playing, it will probably kill you anyway. But like something where it's just you and maybe one ally against an AI that's not that hard. That is where I would recommend starting.
Mm-hmm.
The third DLC came with a faction called the Sappers basically they wander around and build turrets for you to help with defense. Like if I were telling somebody, "Hey, you have all the DLCs, where should you start?" I would say play against a low difficulty AI with Sapper allies, and because one of the goals of the Sappers was to say this is going to help. It's going to make it harder for you to lose, but it's not going to win the game for you. It just gives you more of a margin for error
Mm-hmm.
if you didn't notice something bad was going to happen. And so that's why I think that's a good faction to start, because with some allied factions you'll be like, oh, I'm doing okay, oh, my allies just killed the AI for me, like, because you can have very powerful allied factions, but like something that's not going to win the game, it's just going to make it harder for you to lose and to give you a little friend to wander around and to help build stuff.
Mm-hmm. Yep, and again, it's always that challenge of how do you package this stuff in terms of new, returning, and expert players. Because I was looking at the store pages for the different expansions, and you list like everything that's in these expansions, and I think that's always that challenge. Like when you Europa Universalis is another really good example of that. You go to that store page, there's like 200 different listings of DLC, and it's, I think, again, very difficult sometimes to kind of tell someone or present this stuff in a way that says, okay, if you're a new player, don't look at this. You know, this is not for you. This is for those guys who have spent 100 to 300 hours in this game. You just want to look right over there. And I think there's again, like kind of like our one of the major points of this cast is like there is, I think, a right and wrong way to present this stuff. And it's why games like Factorio and Dyson Sphere and even Elden Ring get it, where a lot of other games, even if there are similar genres who try to copy it, they just kind of like stumble over their own feet when they're trying to show this stuff off.
I think speaking in a broad sense, taking Anno as an example. I love Anno 1800. I've got maybe 30 hours, something like that in there. And then I just kind of got overwhelmed with the number of maps and islands and so forth and some of the repetition of certain things. But Anno, as an example, everything that you buy as a DLC for that pretty much gets added in like immediately.
Mm-hmm.
So if you play an Anno game with having bought no DLC, you get one experience. If you've bought 2 years worth of DLC from Anno, then suddenly you're going to Africa, you've got all these extra things. Is that more complicated? Is it just added interesting things?
Mm-hmm.
You know, like with Anno, it's actually, the answer is it's a bit of both. Yeah, it's more complicated, and also there's just some stuff to do that's different. So but there's no way in game to differentiate between those things. Once you buy the DLC, it's just on. Arcen has always built its DLC in such a way that when you turn it on, it doesn't make it more complex by default. That's been one of the kind of driving principles behind Arcen DLCs, and it's in some ways can lead to people missing some content. The Venators in the third DLC are a great example of that, where if that was a base game concept, we would probably just turn it on. It makes the AI smarter and a bit more reactive to some of the stuff that, like if you're kind of spamming one kind of unit, then it will counter that. It's a great idea by Willard. That said, that makes the game more complicated, and just by buying DLC 3, that would not be okay. So we have to make that an opt-in thing where you say, yeah, I want to have Venators on. That means that more people are going to miss it, but that does keep the faith with customers from our perspective that, yeah, you can just buy all the DLC and then opt into the parts of the content you want as you want it. The quick starts are our way of giving kind of guided slice tours. So we've got like easy, medium, hard quick starts, which have a variety of different scenarios pulled from all the different expansions or just the base game. We then have like, I think there's like there's, I don't remember if the Helping Hands is its own category or not, but there's like ones that make it like way easier to just kind of feel like you're playing with a friend, even though it's an AI or, an NPC. And so that's our philosophy there. And that way, if you see a great deal on all of the, the complete edition, you can just buy it and not worry that you've accidentally hosed yourself by making it way more complicated, because there's some strategy games you can do that with. Yes. And so that's been our strategy in general. And then by describing what the features are, and Necromancer is just totally other way to play. It's somewhat easier. You don't need to know how to play the other part of AI War in order to play it. It's more fluid, and it's this just totally other thing. Well, you could start there. You could buy the game, buy DLC 3 only if you want to, play Necromancer, and never even learn how to play the normal Human Empire. And that would be a perfectly valid way to play it. You could spend all of your time playing yourself versus the AI with really powerful factions next to you. And as Willard mentioned, sometimes they wind up killing the AI for you. And you go, well, that was easier than I meant it to be that time, because my buddies kind of did it. And you're like, I'll crank up the AI even more difficult, I guess. Maybe I'll crank these guys just down one notch. And then you find this weird equilibrium eventually where you're like, okay, we got the right amount of crazy from the AI and the right amount of tuned for my allies. And am now winning because of me instead of because of my ally. Like, there's so many paths in. Mm-hmm. And this is where the original game bit the heck out of us, because the original game was not this varied in quite the same way, but it was still this vastly wide sandbox. So for us, what is AI War? The first one. It's like 12 different distinct metas depending on the player. And we had to somehow encompass all of those, modernize them, and include whatever else we wanted to have. And that was an insane challenge. Hope I never have to do anything like that again. XCOM, moving from the original to the Enemy Within, that at least is mostly one meta or a couple of metas. Still very challenging to do. Firaxis did a very good job. We had easily 12, and some of them we just had to kind of chuck because they just don't fit with the overall ethos. And for those people who were in that meta we chucked, they are forever unhappy with AI War 2. They're not angry at us, which I'm really grateful for, but they're just like, I see what you're doing, I understand, but I'm going to play the first one.
Yep. And
and we're like, yeah, I know. Like, we had to make some choices there because we couldn't be all things to all people. And if we were ever, God forbid, to try and make an AI War 3, second game almost is worse now in some respects in terms of making a challenge to follow up, because now we have to redo the Necromancer again, and all these we made it so much more challenging to follow up. Like, there should never be an AI War 3. Somebody slap me if I'm doing that, because we should make like a new spin-off game, like AI War Chronicles or something, AI War Dancing with Wolves, whatever the heck, they have such weird names for some of the Shin Megami Tensei ones where it's just like, Dancing in Twilight. You're like, what the heck does that mean? Like, okay, but so it's like, AI war, we can't put a number, and we've already had a colon, so now we got a problem. So it's just like, it's got to be like Dancing in AI War Twilight or something weird that really sets it apart, so you know it's not a DLC for the first game. So we've got this new franchise thing that is a narrower subset that's exploring whatever it is we feel like we want to explore, and that's how we would, have to approach any sort of subsequent thing, because trying to sequelize the sum total of a sandbox game that has 6 years of development in both cases, 4 to 6, whatever you want to call it, holy cow, that's not a good idea.
And let's just hope what you just said about never making AI War 3. Let's hope that never comes to pass, or someone's watching this cast in the future.
I know. That's one of those things where it just tempts fate, but it needs to be like spiritual successor, some sort of spin-off. It's not like we're done with the AI War universe, but trying to do a numbered successor, it's kind of like, I don't know. Like, they made Half-Life Alyx. That's a very good game. It's not Half-Life 3, and that's important.
Yep.
And so that it's like, I expect to see more Half-Life games at this point. Portal, that's in the Half-Life universe. Portal 2 is as well. But I don't know if we're ever going to see a Half-Life 3, the number, though, because I don't know that would be smart it'd be a marketing coup, but the expectations, man, I wouldn't want to be on that dev team. But Half-Life Alyx, it sounds like a great time.
Yep, and again, it's that ability to, I guess, again, like, you can go in very different directions with it. And at the same time, I think this is also why we see a lot of live service games who will very rarely, maybe like gun to the head, make a sequel. I mean, I think the only one that really comes to mind would be either Path of Exile 2 and Destiny 2 right now. Like, most live service games, they do not touch that because, again, they know that same thing of, okay, we have 5 years worth of development, patches, and content. How do we move that all over to a brand new game? And as you said, Chris, like, what happens if we can't include a certain system? And let's say that system has like 15-20% of our fan base who really, really wants that. Do you, twist this game into knots to make that work? Or do you say, we can't do it? Like, it would just completely wreck this game. And as you said, I think it's good that the people aren't, taking out the pitchforks and torches. And it's unfortunate, I think, one of those, damned if you do, damned if you don't kind of situations.
I think among MMOs, like Final Fantasy 11 to 14, are a good example. I mean, that only survived because it was Square Enix, and because they made some very moral choices at the time. Final Fantasy 11 was a very last gen sort of game. It was an MMO that was built one way, had a big fan base, but not as big as they wanted, blah, blah, blah. They started sunsetting that, started building Final Fantasy 14. They built out their original version, and what do you know? They had the exact same problem that AI War 2 had at the start. It's too small compared to the one before it, and it's not fun in the same way that the other one is, and their player base just hemorrhaged and kind of rioted. So what did they do? They did the same thing that we did. They did before we did it, but I wasn't following that at the time. Mm-hmm. But what they did, actually, it was kind of cool because they canonically in their actual MMO, like diegetically, they destroyed the world. They had like the moon, something came out of the moon, came down, destroyed everything. They were like, see ya in a year, and cut it off, and then came back with what they call a realm reborn, which is basically after the moon destroyed most everything, here's the new game. And people were receptive to that, and it was but not as good as Final Fantasy 11, And then they started doing DLC after DLC after DLC. And at this point, I think they're 8 or 10 years into development, something like this now. And, it's this like hot phenomenon of an MMO. There's still some people who are like, yeah, but it's not as good as 11 was. Most of their fan base is either new or does not share that opinion. but I shudder to think the bill they had, and it might not have paid off. With AI War 2, we got away with a reputation. It did not pay off at all. It's made buckets of money for Final Fantasy 14, and it saved their reputation. This was a reputation save for us and a learning experience, but it's not financially rewarding. Just because, so there are rare instances of this sort of thing around, and it's a big gamble to do the ethical thing or just let something die.
Yep, and again, it's something that we've seen developers do kind of, they go both ways in some cases. That some will, ride the game into the ground in order to try and keep profits going, and it can, completely blacklist a studio. We've seen lots of developers, especially in the mobile and free-to-play space over the last 10 years, who have done just that, and once you kind of cross that line with the consumer base, they're not coming back for your next game. What is it? What's that expression? Once burned, twice shy kind of thing.
Yep. Yeah, exactly.
And I'll give a shout out to Chris Coleman and Chekos. We were talking about DLCs making the game harder, and they brought up Darkest Dungeon. I was thinking that at the exact same time in terms of how a DLC can radically change a game. And we've been mentioning XCOM, and I always find Firaxis' approach to the XCOM expansion so fascinating, because they really build almost like games within their own games with their expansions, and it really turns into like this completely different experience. If you play vanilla XCOM 2 and War of the Chosen, I know in interviews, I think Jake was saying that he wanted that the expansion could have very well been just XCOM 3. And I just find that kind of work so fascinating. I think that takes a very huge amount of confidence to just say, yeah, here's our old game, we liked it, now we're doing all this stuff completely different, and we're going to put that right on top of the game that you've already played.
I think it's a safe bet in some ways. I mean, XCOM has the advantage of, the new XCOM has the advantage of having a mission sort of structure. And so and that's sort of what we're trying to ape with our quick starts in a lot of ways. But when your entire game is built around a structure like that, which, Willard and I were talking the other week about how, the original StarCraft and the original, like Warcraft 2 and Warcraft 1 both were that way, where they were, we were there for the story structure, the story missions, you know what I mean? And most RTS games and a lot of other strategy games in general are not really built that way now. They're built for being either sandboxes or skirmishes, and AI War 2 is one of those. And it's much harder when you're building in a sandbox or skirmish mode. I mean, Necromancer and some of that other stuff, that could have been a standalone game. It's really good. It's huge. Introducing that to players is probably harder for us than some of the stuff that is happening in the XCOM expansions you're talking about, because for them, you just play the new campaign, and you get onboarded into that through the same sort of processes that they're already used to. So from a production standpoint, it's probably the lowest risk approach they could possibly take if you have a game that's profitable to start with. If you're trying to take a game that is not profitable and turn it profitable, a la Final Fantasy 14, which was bleeding money for a really long time, it's a very risky approach to take, but a very ethical one, and it paid off well for them. For us, the opposite, but learning, so we got that out of it. And, in States, the DLCs have been, we've had a very large attach rate. So the people who buy AI War 2 and, keep it have, in way larger than industry average, bought into our DLCs, which is really great. That tells us that, we're on to something there. It's just we're having either trouble reaching our full audience possible in a crowded market, or that we built something that is inherently niche to a certain extent, also possible. It's kind of unknowable to an extent. And so from that standpoint, we can go, okay, we could be very proud of the DLCs. We could see that people who like the game are very accepting of them and, feel like they add a lot. But that fundamentally the game is just not at the weight class we needed to be to support the company. So time to wrap that up. But that's a fine thing. I mean,
again, it's that's always been, I think, one of the biggest risks of long-term game development like that, in terms of how long do you keep working on a project? Because I know when we, I think, first spoke, this was like back with like a Valor Without Win and Valor Without Win 2. I know you had that approach of wanting to put like everything into these games. Just make the biggest, most. I want every idea that I can come up with into these titles. And
that's a new developer sort of problem.
Yeah.
It's a really bad idea.
And again, like, we've seen the market of developers who have tried to chase that if, game at retail is a moderate success, surely if I put, 2 more years of content into it, I'll get, 2 more years of value out of it. And I think, again, it's that issue of knowing when a game is done. And when we say done this score, we don't mean like 1.0. We mean, I'm done. Like, it's time to go to the next game. Because it's very rare. I think this is something I was just talking to another developer about. It's rare for one game to sustain a studio or to be the only game of that company. Again, people will point to stuff like Minecraft or Among Us or what's another good example? Or even
Factorio.
Yeah, Factorio. But it doesn't last forever. And if you try to just keep pushing it, eventually you're going to hit that point where everyone who's bought the game, who is going to give you money, is done with it. Like, they've gotten their money's worth 100 times over. Why should I keep buying this game?
I would say that, like, for us with the first AI War, that was such a cash cow that kind of spoiled me in some respects. And so I started treating them, so before live service games was a concept, but I started treating it almost as if it was a live service game, not that people needed to pay, that's different, but as if I was going to support it as if it was a live service game. And you see that attitude in developers sometimes, and it can be very damaging to them. AI War 1 was supporting us for a really long time.
Yep.
When it started tapering off, we tapered down as well. And then when it was getting to a point where it's just like, yeah, the juice is not worth the squeeze. Also, we're kind of out of ideas. And we're like, let's end gracefully and just stop. Valor Without the Wind, that was our third title. And that was something where it had a very strong launch. Not as strong as we quite hoped for, but it was still doing well. And then thought, well, we could just get it to the next level if we do X, Y, Z. And that turned out to be kind of, we should have moved on. Because the game was done, and it was fun for people who were already enjoying it, and trying to broaden the thing is that once your game has a perception in the market, that's it. It doesn't get rewritten, except when it does. No Man's Sky is a weird example. I know, yeah, exactly. There are exceptions, but they're exceptions that prove the rule for everybody else, And No Man's Sky is a weird example because, again, they were able to do something that should have been profoundly unprofitable, but they'd already made more money than they needed for the rest of their lives. So when you have, tens of millions of dollars for a staff of 6, you can just stop and leave, or you can work for free or not much money, do whatever. You've already made your money. What's the problem? You can just plow in more. And then if the perception turns around, which it did for them, then great. If it doesn't, okay. Maybe you've redeemed yourself, though. When it's not profitable and you've made promises, a la Kickstarter, that's a much tougher sell.
Yep.
That's where you're really stuck. That's where I was with AOR 2. Any other project that I've ever done, when it starts drifting down in profits, you stop doing meaningful post-release support. You go, people can enjoy it for what it is. It's done. Some companies that I won't name put out so many different DLCs for things.
Mm-hmm.
You can tell that they're milking it, and the consumers get pretty used to the fact that it's not a fair deal, and that creates its own set of problems, and trying to stay away from that sort of thing. So, finding you're going to be leaving some money on the table from a perspective of, are we putting out $15,000 worth of DLC? Like there's a few games that have that literally on Steam. Or, are we, you want to leave people wanting more. So you find that point where you're diminishing, people want more, but you say, we're still done though, because this is where it is, and that's a good place to be.
Yeah, I know with the Battle Brothers developer, I know they had some trouble with getting more content because people want more of the game, but they didn't really want to do it, and they kind of got forced into it. And again, it's that very weird twist. I think it's something that's really been developed over the last 5 to 6 years of people want more of their games. If they like a game and they see more content, they're going to enjoy more of that content. But there's always that point where it just goes, how much more can I reasonably get out of this one idea? And I think it's why a lot of developers like Clay, I don't once their games are out, not in early access, but 1.0, in rare exception, they typically move on. They may do a little bit of updates here and there, but it's not like they're going to be working on the same game for additional 3 to 5 years after 1.0.
Yeah. I think it depends on the market and the developer, and if you're able to hire some people to kind of help with that to some extent. Keith and I were done with Last Federation after the first DLC, but then the programmer from our fan base had some great ideas, and it was like, I'd like to do blah 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 blah. He pitched me on what he wanted to do, and I was like, cool. Let's add in these other elements over here. Can you add those so it feels like a fleshed out DLC? And I'll pay for the art and the music that's going to go in for this. And he's like, yep. And so we set up an arrangement. He built it in over a couple of months. We released it. I had very little to do with it. I didn't have to spend all that much time on it. And that worked out great. You see the same sort of thing with mods. And games that have modding support can often have a really long lifespan. That was one of the big things we wanted to add in AOR 2 that AOR 1 didn't have. So, there's different strategies, but if people are wanting more and you want to stop, because you're in a good spot.
Yep.
If they're left wanting more, they're feeling positive. If they feel like they didn't get their money's worth, that's a different conversation. Yeah. That's two different conversations.
Yeah.
But people going, I just love it so much, I just want more. Often they regret what they get. It depends, but I felt that way about, for instance, the first Pixel Junk Monsters. That was one of the earlier tower defense games I played. It was not the first, but it was one of the ones that really grabbed me. And I really wanted more. And then they made a DLC, and I didn't like it. Mm-hmm. And then they made a sequel, and I really hated it.
Yep.
That's the way it goes.
Yep, it's better for somebody to leave your game knowing they got their money's worth, rather than because they either got tired of the game, or they just ended up hating it. Again, we brought up the Elden Ring, first 100 hours or 80 hours, great. But then if you start to get annoyed with that, you don't want that bad taste in someone's mouth of the game.
Yeah.
We did have a question come in from Jamal Bayless. They asked, did you have any ideas on iterating on the Last Federation?
Speaking of leaving people wanting more, I need to bow out for the night.
Yeah.
But it was a
Okay.
pleasure talking to both of you.
All right, Willard, have a great night. Thanks for coming on,
All right.
and I'll
Thanks.
talk to you soon. Okay. While you can answer that question, I need to adjust our overlays. So,
Sure.
let me do that. Let's see if I can speed run this as quickly as possible. Let's see. Oh,
Iterating with the last Federation, we had that was a pretty short project in the main. We did a pre-production period of like 2 months where we thought we were going to be building a project called Starport 28, and that really didn't work out all that well. So then we knew that within like half a month, and so then we shifted, and we were trying to do something that was going to be space based, but we weren't sure how we were going to do the combat. We wanted it to not be like AI War. We didn't want it an RTS. So some of the first stuff we tried was vaguely FTL inspired, but we didn't want to just copy FTL either. And we didn't want to have all the ship management stuff. Like it needed to have its own identity. So we had all these different mock-ups and prototypes and things we went through for combat in particular. And most of them just didn't work. And then we wound up doing like, well, what if we did this one that's more like a shmup, bullet hell type game? I'd always been wanting terrain in space. I've been frustrated by the fact that there is no terrain in space, and that means that any point you're at kind of equal to any other point in a lot of respects, and that's kind of difficult in a strategy game when it's like position doesn't super matter. If you're in range to shoot at the person, or if there is no concept of range, then where you're at doesn't really matter, or it's too complicated to matter if there's so many ships. And so, versus like an archer up on a hill has an advantage, or somebody behind a wall is able to do whatever, a siege weapon doing, in a terrestrial sort of RTS or game like that. So I really wanted walls in space, and I'd been trying different mechanics for that for a long time. We had the first AI War before it came out. There were different types of had these weird wall things that had like these kind of networks that when an enemy would hit it, they would snap to it and then get pushed through the network in the pattern you designed. So you could send them on these like spiraling paths and stuff. It was kind of weird. And then later we just had bubble force fields and stuff, which is what actually made it in the game that would block things, units, and then the larger wormhole networks that also kind of made for larger terrain. And what we kind of realized was, bullets make terrain in space. When you've got bullets all over the place, that's terrain. A shmup is something that has just a pretty background, and then bullets and enemies are the things that actually matter. And so we're like, oh, that's interesting, And so we built a real-time one and went, that's too different. That's two really different skill sets. This grand strategy concept and then the actual bullet hell game. No, that's not going to work. We wound up repurposing that into Starward Rogue a couple years later. But we were like, okay, so I don't know. What if this was a turn-based shmup? How would that even work? Well, you see how it works. That's what we did. But those things took a lot of iterations to get combat going. Once we had the core of combat and kind of the general idea of which races we were going to pull in. Those races were originally part of Starport 28. Then it was like, okay, well, mechanically, how are those going to work? And, what do we need to add? And it pretty much was all just additions. And we built the entire rest of the game in 4 months at that point. And, that had post-release support and so forth, but it wasn't like it wasn't a huge amount of like new content or anything that was needed at that point. It was, it was content-rich game already. It was more stuff like what happened in the Biscuit Federation, where it was like, oh yeah, the good races should find it horrifying when you dump toxic waste onto a planet repeatedly and poison their populace to death. And it was like, oh yeah, we hadn't thought of somebody doing that, but then John Bain did that and commented on it. And he joked in his video that we had to patch that out. We didn't patch it out. We knew that he'd done it. We were just said, okay, you can keep doing that, but there has to be the consequence of those guys going, you're poisoning them to death. We don't find you ethical. And some people, some of the Federation going, not ethics, we're cool with that. And other parts of the Federation going, we secede, we're forming our own rival Federation. You're going, now I've got to kill the good guys in order to have my Federation of amoral / evil people actually survive if I want to win the game. Whoops. Well, interesting story for, that's kind of what it is. It is a strategy game, but at the same time, it's a procedural story generator in a lot of ways. Like Dwarf Fortress or RimWorld or, pick one of those.
All right. As a time check, we are about 2 hours and 45 minutes into the chat. So I figure maybe another, I'd say like 15 and 20 minutes. I do want to kind of talk about what you have plans for next. For people watching this live, most likely we are not going to have a separate game stream tonight because I don't think I can do 4 hours of chatting with Chris and then another 4 hours of playing. But as a final point, for people watching this live, if you do have any questions for Chris about Arcen or any of his games, please get them in the next few minutes. This will be final call for questions. So, I guess to kind of talk about where things are going now, as we were talking about before the stream, obviously you can't go into too many specifics. So, I guess what are your plans next for Arcen?
We are. We've been working on prototyping for several different projects, 2 of which we're planning to go into production with, not at the same time, but we have essentially our next 2 projects planned out. The next one was planned to be a new IP completely separate from the Arcenverse, which is like our sci-fi multiverse that AI War 2 and a lot of the other ones are set into. And when I wrote the big kind of finale post for AI War 2, that's what I said was going to be happening next. We actually pushed that one back a bit because in the interim, there's another idea. It's one that I've been noodling on for about 7 years now, really, since 2015, I think. And we've had kind of a break in that one in terms of, let's do that one next, actually. And so that one actually is set in the Arcenverse. It's more back towards the kind of old Earth time period before Earth something happens to it. And the AI War series is set, much further on into the future in space, and the Last Federation set even further. Bionic Dews and In Case of Emergency Release Raptor are both set more in the old Earth time period. And this is vaguely in that time period, but different locales from either one of those. And it is a strategy title, but it's something that should be mechanically, familiar, where you're not feeling too alien when you get in there, but it's there's a lot of novelty to it at the same time, but where we're trying to just really nail the vertical slice where you're having fun in 5 minutes. That's my goal. Is how are somebody playing like from the start? Now we build up from there. And so we've been through a lot of design iterations on this, and finally I think have nailed what we want to do with that. So we're in the early stages of executing on that, and so far so good. And so this will be the first of our titles developed under kind of the new philosophy, where we flip it the other way around and develop from the new player experience, and then the other systems kick in later. And actually, one of the interesting things that I'll say about this is it's planned that there's a couple of different kind of like campaign modes. And most strategy games are both a tactics and a strategy game, at least to some extent, right? Because if it's a strategy game, that means that there's some sort of grand plan that you're executing that you came up with. That's what strategy means. Versus tactics is execution, right? And so I got to thinking about it, and I was like, there's no military academy in the world that would try and teach somebody that way. That's insanity, right? You don't like, it's not like you're coming in at 4-star general level and it's like, okay, we're starting you out. This is your first day in 4-star general training. It's like, nobody starts there. That's insane, But why are we starting that way in strategy games? So it's like, okay, in the earlier modes, it's not a tutorial, but it's also not a strategy game. Let's teach you tactics. We'll handle the strategy. The mode will handle the strategy. Let's teach you tactics. That is you learning to play the tactics of the game by figuring it out as you go. And, so there's a game like Elden Ring, right? You learn Elden Ring by figuring it out as you go. They show you a few things. They show you how to move around and that sort of stuff. But overall, if you've played a game vaguely like that, you know how to play, right? But then they just kind of throw you in, and it's like the discovery of that guy kills me really big. Avoid that guy. That's you learning to play on your own. That's much better than a tutorial where it's like you're starting going, it's like, did you know some enemies are way too strong for you and maybe you should avoid them? No, they let you figure that out. And the figuring it out is part of the fun. But not if you're also trying to figure out, like, why the heck am I even here?
Yeah.
Like, you know what I mean? Like, there's a capacity that every brain has for, how much new information can we take in at once. The people who are able to onboard themselves into strategy games that you're bouncing off of, by the way, doesn't mean their brain is larger than yours. It just means they've played something else in that genre before. So they're not having to, there are things they're not having to learn that they're just taking for granted that you're having to learn. So your brain is getting overloaded and theirs is not. So they get in and you do not. And that's how it works with any genre. For somebody who's new to Dark Souls and doesn't have the mantra of get good, if they just come to it completely blind, you're like, I don't know if this game is 5 hours long or 50 hours long or what's going on. Like, they're going to bounce off of it probably. If they don't have like the social, like versus Elden Ring, they won't. And that's the difference. And so for us, it's kind of like, all right, well, take that approach. Take the let's boil it down to tactics. Let you figure out the tactics versus having lots of you can do blah 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 blah. Like, let's not do that. Let's tell you the controls. Let's have a controlled scenario that lets you learn tactics by figuring it out yourself, which is really fun. And then let's let you graduate to the next level, and then next level. All right, tactics, and now strategy. And that's the goal with that, which is kind of interesting because that means you're not even playing a strategy game for the first however many hours it takes you to get through the first couple of campaigns. You're playing a tactics game. And then, after you've mastered tactics, it's time for strategy. And you're still using your tactics. But a lot of your strategies can be formulated on the fact that, one, you've kind of had a little bit of strategy osmosis through the earlier campaigns that you've gone through, because you've seen whatever the strategy was that's baked into the campaign, that's inherent in it. But then also, a bunch of tactics and you understand the landscape, so you can formulate a strategy. It's kind of like, again, I'll pick Elden Ring. It's like, this boss seems too hard. I'm going to go, there's other bosses. I know there's other bosses. I'm going to go work on some of them. And when I come back, I will be stronger. And I also will have gotten more good. And so you can formulate the strategy of, I'm going to leave and I will be back. And they don't tell you to do that. You figure it out, and it feels better for having done that.
And again, it's that idea of you have to give the player enough of a start before you let them go off on their own. And it's why so many strategy games tend to fail at that, as we've said over this cast, that if you give the player everything right from the start, you're going to overwhelm their brains. With Elden Ring, you can start it up, go right down that tutorial, and then go into the world. And even once you go into the world, it's still very much a long or lengthy process before the game kind of says, okay, what do you want to do? But the player needs to kind of get to that point on their own. You can't force the player. It's kind of like kicking them out of school before you taught them numbers and letters, and you just kick them out and say, okay, go get a job.
One of the things I would criticize about Breath of the Wild is it nails the opening.
Mm-hmm.
The Great Plateau is fantastic, but then they're determined to let you go absolutely anywhere in any order at that point. And they've got guide markers to like, okay, you need to go to Kakariko Village and this, that, and the other, which Elden Ring is able to get by without, which is great, actually. But then it's like, there's 4 divine beasts, and you can do them or not do them. You can do them in any order. And, now we have a difficulty curve problem. Because those things don't scale in difficulty or complexity. And so that really screws with Breath of the Wild's mid-game. And then if you spend time in Breath of the Wild getting good, and you've done all the other stuff, which is probably part of how you got good, now the difficulty curve of fighting the final boss is you walk in and breathe on him and he dies because you're way over leveled. So I love Breath of the Wild. I don't, those criticisms aren't enough to really cause a problem from my end. But they are things that Elden Ring, for instance, dodges and does much better by having a more. They're able to have a linear progression of difficulty and all this sort of stuff, but the way that they map out their things. Yeah. Elden Ring has other problems, specifically with its late game, but it solved the early and middle game problems. Like no game's perfect. And I think we should be able to talk critically about every game, even if it's our recent beloved new treasure that is shiny and is supposed to be criticism proof. I don't really believe in that. But,
wait until you see the critical thought video I have going up tomorrow. Or today as we're past midnight here for sure.
Yeah.
Yeah, and again, it's always that difficulty of how you present this stuff to the player, because that's how, again, your onboarding works. And if you don't think about onboarding, you're not thinking about what the UX of this game is. And I think this is, where I think a lot of indie developers have really had to have kind of like a little minor reckoning on, is that people really do care about the UX more these days than they did 15, 20 years ago. Like we said with the original AI War, you could get away with being this very complicated strategy game because there weren't, dozens of real-time or complicated strategy games, and there weren't all these games vying for your attention.
Yeah.
Today,
we weren't competing with Fortnite. There wasn't such a multimedia whatever. There was cable TV, and there was Netflix was a thing. You got DVDs in the mail. That was not a service. You know what I mean? It was a different world, and there were a lot of really key ways. And a lot of the people who were playing a game like AI War, there were many reasons that somebody would play a game like AI War. One of them was that they didn't have a computer that could run the AAA stuff. That was a very common reason for people to play indie titles back then, was they didn't have a console, they didn't have a great computer. This was a way for them to play interesting games. That was one part of our audience. Another part was people who were underserved in these complex other genres like strategy or whatever. There wasn't a behemoth like Paradox churning out all the content you could possibly ever want in that, and then polishing the UX. There just wasn't that sort of competition. And, the idea of a puzzle platformer, as weird as this sounds, was a fairly novel thing. There were not many of those. And so you can probably count those on one hand in 2008. And indie platformers in general were fairly novel, and to the point where it's like Braid, I think, came out in 2007, I want to say, and it's like,
Somewhere in there.
yeah, that guy's kind of a stand-in for Mario, isn't he? It's like, I don't think anybody would make that comparison anymore. And the guy is a stand-in for Mario, and the whole twist at the end is a quite clever twist. It's an interesting story, but nowadays people wouldn't say that's a stand-in for Mario because this is a guy in a tuxedo. That's too different in today's crowded market. That's just a platformer. Nobody would make that extra connection to Mario but back then there were so few platformers that, yeah, sure, Mario, of course. Because it's a guy rescuing a princess, so what else would it be?
Mm-hmm.
I feel like a million things now.
Look at the deck building roguelike genre. That has exploded. And
yeah,
again, I keep saying this. Like, I'm still loving to play every one that gets sent to me, but there are a lot of people who are sick and tired of it. And that is something you really need to consider with the market today. That what is the market fatigue of this game? The whole Among Us craze. That as soon as Among Us blew up in 2020, everyone tried to make another Among Us. Just like everyone tried to make another Fortnite. And the market was simply not there, and they didn't want to play 5 different Among Uses.
We talked about first mover and second mover advantages earlier in this cast. Fortnite is the second mover, if you recall.
Yeah.
Because, and Fortnite is a classic second mover because it's the more polished, brought out sooner version of the original. There were obviously several second movers, but Fortnite is the one that stuck, and it's really hard for a lot of people to remember that PUBG was the first mover and that Fortnite wasn't the original. Minecraft is a second mover. There were a bunch of other things like it right beforehand, and it was among the second movers that, like Infiniminer, I think, was the first mover. And Minecraft is the one that polished it and put in all the elements that it needed to have. And so a lot of what we think of as these original first mover things actually are second movers.
Again, Slay the Spire was inspired by games like Dream Quest, and there was that other one that I can't remember the name of. It was like it was like kind of like 2D characters running left to right.
Huh.
I can't. I think it came out in like 2014, 2015. But it had like a mobile version as well. Oh no! Again, when you have like over 3,000 games, it's hard to remember all of them. But yeah, like Slay the Spire. But again, like as you said, like there is that misconception that when you blow up, that you're the first, even if you're not necessarily the first. And it becomes harder for those games again, like for people to say, "Oh, I'm just going to copy Slay the Spire," or "I'll just make it a little bit better." But again, like Slay the Spire and just like Fortnite, they got it right on their attempts, and they became that standard. And
and there's a certain element of timing as well. It's not to take anything away from anyone, but if you look at Bill Gates and Steve Jobs, both of them, they were born like within a year of one another. And there was this one, it's in a couple of different biographies that I read. But essentially, we're looking at it, and if it hadn't been those two guys, it would have been somebody else. Because that was the window of opportunity. If they'd been born a little bit earlier, a little bit later, they would not have had the lives they had. It doesn't take anything away from their accomplishments, but it is recognizing some of the reality of it. And when you look at the original AI War, I didn't have some master plan for the timing of it when it came out. I was the recipient of the exact same kind of luck on a much smaller scale that Steve Jobs or Bill Gates was. If I had made AI War a year earlier, it would not have been able to get on Steam. It would not have launched Arcen. If I had made it a year later, probably a year later would have been okay, but it would have been rougher. If I made it 3 or 4 years later, nope, no Arcen. I might have been able to like finagle some other stuff around a different way, but it would have been a very different Arcen. And so you got to look at your stuff. Slay the Spire came out, and as soon as it came out, everything was different in its niche. End of story. Whatever was going on before, everything after is different. And so the bar has been raised, and you got to do something different, and so on and so forth. And so you're living, if you're trying to make a vaguely Slay the Spire, like some sort of deck building game, you're in a post Slay the Spire world now. And we hear that a lot about Elden Ring. If like anybody's making an open world game now, they're in a post Elden Ring world. That sounds very dramatic and impressive. And it is. Elden Ring is a big achievement, but we have microcosms of that multiple times a year, all the time. And whatever the new gold standard is in every genre and subgenre is, you're in a post that world immediately. And if you started development on whatever it is you're doing prior to that, you got to adapt in the mid-development to whatever just happened. And I think that's one reason that Starward Rogue didn't do better, because when we started development, it was only 3-month development. It was brief anyway. But Enter the Gungeon and Nuclear Throne both came out between us starting development and us finishing development. And, what are you going to do? Right? It didn't make Starward Rogue a worse game. It's actually quite a good game. It's a really good game. But it does not stand out in the market. And it also blends genres so that you need to enjoy kind of Binding of Isaac-like games and real-time shmups. And again, as noted earlier, that narrows you to the intersection of people who enjoy those. And the number of people who enjoy shmups is a lot lower than I had anticipated.
And again, when you do something new or combine things differently, you don't know what that market is going to be.
Yeah. So there's always an element of you're rolling the dice, period.
Yeah. Right. But I think with that, we are over 3 hours in. I think we can wrap things up. But yeah, again, Chris, as always, let's not wait another 3 years for our next chat, for sure.
Yeah, it's been a crazy few years. So
I know.
It's between COVID and everything, and I got married for a second time and everything, and it's been an interesting period with a lot of life changes. So.
And you grew a beard too. That was not there last time I saw you.
That's true. Yeah, I had a much smaller goatee, but yeah, at this point, it's yep.
So I think to wrap things up, so in terms of your upcoming projects, do you have anything you'd like to tease in terms of announcement dates or reveals, anything for the people who are still up with us at this time?
I'd love to, but I can't. I've got things are different this time around, is all I can say, and you'll find out in the next couple of months. I'm very excited about it. It's a new chapter for Arcen coming up. New way of doing things in a lot of ways. But some of these things are not mine to tell anymore, which is kind of cool.
All right. So I guess with that, do you have anything you'd like to say to the fans watching before we kind of go in our end of stream, I guess, wrap up?
Well, I thank everybody for sticking around this long, for sure. And you can always find us on Discord if you've got any follow-up questions or anything. We're around on Reddit too, to a lesser extent. There's a AI War subreddit, which is there, and then there's the Arcen Games Discord. We're pretty accessible, so you can find us.
Any other social media you want to plug, anything like that?
Those are really the two big ones. We've got an inexplicable Twitter following and so forth, and we do post our news and stuff on there. But really, it's kind of Discord and the Steam forums and Reddit are pretty much the places that are that we can keep up with, and that where most of the audience seems to be.
All right, I'll include links to that in the description for the recorded version. So, Chris, it sounds like there's definitely a lot coming for Arcen Games in the next few months, and definitely best of luck with that. And I'll be surely excited to be able to check that out when the time comes.
All right, thanks so much.
All right, so you wouldn't mind hanging on the call for like 10 seconds afterwards? We'll just have a bit of a wrap up. It won't be 5 hours, hopefully, but we'll see. But for the people watching this live or recorded, thank you so much for tuning in. Be sure to do all the liking, subscribing, and commenting. For those of you watching this live, there will not be a game stream tonight. We'll be returning for that tomorrow, starting around 9:30 ET. Be sure to check out the Discord, Patreon, and Twitter and all that. There are links down below and up there, as well as my game design books. So, Chris, thank you again for coming on. Like I said, definitely don't be a stranger, and I'm sure we'll chat again in the future.
Yeah, likewise. Thanks for having me.
Not a problem. So for the folks watching this, thank you for tuning in. Come back for daily discussions on game design here and on game wisdom, where some of the art and science of games. Until next time, everybody, take care.